our guy Ethan just woke up, only to find himself staring at a beautiful deer woman. But there's a catch. An angry tribal priestess is about to plunge a sacrificial dagger straight into his chest. Just moments ago, he was a regular engineer exploring a cave, before a sky portal spat him into a starving beastkin tribe, who immediately marked him as a sacrifice. But little did they know, killing him would be their biggest mistake. With his modern knowledge, Ethan is about to purify their water, produce salt, and forge weapons this primitive world has never seen. Instead of a sacrifice, they just found their new leader, and he is about to build the most powerful tribe in the entire In the vast world of beasts, water is life, and survival is determined by who controls it. A strategic tactical map, illuminated by the warm glow of a flickering fire, reveals a crucial oasis in the heart of the desert, a shining beacon of blue energy currently being encircled by aggressive red markers. This vital water source became the battleground for two powerful rival factions. On the left, a demonic red skull marks the territory of the aggressive Crimson-Hoof tribe, while a dark bear claw print on the right represents the Black Wing tribe, both marching across the divided terrain toward the exact same blue oasis. The brutal conflict ended in swift defeat for the Black Wing tribe. On the map, the crimson flags of their rivals are now planted firmly in the center of the oasis, surrounded by a ring of painted red fire, while the black markers of the defeated tribe fade into a solitary line of retreat, leaving them exiled from their ancestral lands. The desperate survivors of the Black Wing tribe retreated deep into a desolate, rocky wasteland under a dark, stormy sky. As the weary warriors huddled around, dim campfires surrounded by wooden bone totems, the heavily clouded heavens suddenly fractured, revealing a massive, crackling blue electrical energy pattern. The Beastkin warriors looked up in sheer awe and terror as a massive dimensional rift tore open in the sky. Brilliant spiderwebs of blue electricity arced across the clouds, casting an eerie glow over their primitive, bone-crafted encampment. Plummeting headfirst through the chaotic vortex of lightning came a young human man named Ethan, his modern clothes torn into a simple dark tunic as he fell from the sky and crashed directly onto the barren earth below. Ethan lay unconscious and face down in the dirt, completely covered in grime from his sudden fall. Instantly, hostile Blackwing warriors closed in, pointing their heavy metal-tipped spears and double-bladed axes suspiciously at his defenseless body. Stepping through the crowd was Elder Grizelda, the High Priestess of the Blackwing tribe. Her deeply wrinkled face was etched with anger as she pointed, her animal skull staff toward the stranger, declaring him a hairless star of calamity who had shattered their ancestral protection and brought about their defeat. Bound tightly to a primitive wooden travois, the unconscious Ethan was dragged through the muddy camp toward a towering central totem pole, while the demoralized members of the tribe watched the grim procession under the gathering storm. As he slowly began to regain consciousness, Ethan opened his eyes in complete confusion, his face now marked with two horizontal blue tribal lines as he struggled to understand where he was. He instinctively tried to pull away, but his wrists were tightly bound with rough, thick ropes made of vines and fibers, pinning him securely against his dark leather arm braces. Ethan found himself securely strapped to a massive gray stone monolith on the altar, his chest now adorned with a heavy necklace of animal teeth and claws. Looking out at the bizarre, hostile crowd, his face tensed with worry as he tried to piece together his situation. The massive stone sacrificial altar stood on a raised, circular platform in the middle of a desolate, rocky valley. Surrounded by steep cliffs and dry brush, the desolate setting felt entirely isolated from the rest of the world. Inside a nearby rocky cavern shelter, the remaining members of the Black Wing tribe huddled together in absolute defeat. Malnourished, exhausted, and wearing ragged animal furs, their animal ears and antlers drooped from the toll of hunger and sickness. Seeking a desperate way to save her people, Elder Grizelda marched toward the platform with fierce determination, her skull-topped staff in hand as her strongest warriors followed closely behind. She thrust her staff forward, directing her warriors to prepare the platform for the ritual, her expression cold and completely uncompromising. Standing at the base of the monument, Grizelda held a curved, dark sacrificial stone dagger in her hand, ready to perform the ancient rite while her guards stood by with crude wooden clubs. Ethan hung his head slightly, staring down in resignation as the sharp edge of the sacrificial dagger was brought close to his body, marking the start of the ritual. In his mind, Ethan's thoughts spiraled into a panicked frenzy, completely bewildered by the sight of animal-eared tribal children staring at him with intense, wide-eyed curiosity. He mentally screamed in frustration, weeping over his bizarre transmigration. He was supposed to be a modern engineer exploring an underground river, not a direct target for a grumpy, staff-wielding tribal elder. Back in reality, Elder Grizelda stood directly in front of Ethan, staring at him with a cold, evaluating gaze, while Ethan stared back with a serious, defiant expression, desperately trying to find a way to communicate. The surrounding crowd of beastkin raised their axes and spears into the air, their desperate, angry shouts demanding the sacrifice be completed to save them from starvation and the impending beast tide. Despite the sharp, curved sacrificial blade hovering near his head, Ethan forced himself to remain incredibly calm under pressure, focusing his analytical mind to find a way out. Still bound to the monolith, Ethan began speaking urgently, attempting to use his modern engineering knowledge to bargain for his survival. He spoke rapidly, his expression intense as he tried to explain that their misfortunes were not caused by some supernatural star of calamity, but by simple, logical issues. Elder Grizelda narrowed her eyes in skepticism, deeply suspicious of the strange, fast-talking outsider, but momentarily pausing to listen to his desperate claims. Ethan pressed on with absolute conviction, explaining that if they suffered from illness, it was due to contaminated water, and if their weapons failed, it was because their crafting methods were outdated, problems he could easily fix. However, Grizelda's expression hardened once more, remaining entirely unconvinced by the stranger's foreign logic as she chose to stick to the rigid laws of her ancestors. Letting out an angry battle cry, the High Priestess raised the dark stone dagger high above her head, preparing to strike Ethan down to complete the ritual. Just as the blade was about to plunge, a young warrior named Lyra leapt onto the platform and grabbed Grizelda's arm, halting the dagger mid-air with her own bone blade. Her glowing blue antlers and fierce protective expression caught the priestess completely off guard. Ethan stared in wide-eyed shock over Lyra's shoulder, utterly stunned and relieved that this young beastkin girl had put her own life on the line to defend him. At the base of the altar, the massive bear-like warrior Barrett watched the sudden, unprecedented confrontation with a solemn and intense expression. The entire camp fell into a tense, silent standoff as Lyra stood firmly on the platform next to the bound human, holding the sacrificial blade back, while the surrounding warriors gripped their spears in confusion. Locked in a fierce struggle of wills, Lyra stared defiantly into Grizelda's eyes, refusing to let the priestess complete the execution while Ethan watched the tense argument unfold. High up in the rocky canyon, tribal sentries clutching long wooden spears kept a vigilant lookout, maintaining a defensive perimeter while the leadership of the tribe fractured. Turning her head slightly, Lyra offered Ethan a silent look of reassurance, her expressive brown eyes filled with an absolute, unwavering determination to protect him. Stepping back, Elder Grizelda pointed her spear toward the murmuring crowd, loudly defending the necessity of the ancient sacrifice, while Lyra maintained her protective, defensive stance beside the bound engineer. But before the argument could progress, Lyra suddenly gasped and looked up toward the horizon, her face displaying an expression of complete shock and awe at a sudden, dramatic shift in the atmosphere. Sensing the impending change, Barrett and the other warriors tightened their grips on their heavy weapons. Lyra looked upward with wide, curious brown eyes, her pointed ears twitching beneath her small blue antlers. Beside her, the wrinkled face of Elder Grizelda remained tense against the backdrop of a cloudy, desolate sky and the stark, dead tree trunks of the wasteland. In front of the anxious crowd, Barrett stood firmly as the formidable vanguard of the Blackwing warriors. Clutching his massive wooden spear, the bare-eared fighter and his comrades braced themselves, their eyes filled with tense anticipation. Suddenly, Elder Grizelda's expression twisted into utter shock and fear, her mouth falling open as she stared toward the sky. Beside her, Lyra's defiant stance softened into a worried, bewildered look, while the bound and helpless, Ethan remained trapped on the blurry altar behind them. From behind the two women, the altar loomed in the dim twilight. Though Ethan remained tightly bound to the stone pillar, the massive stone stag statue looming over him began to pulse with a strange, fiery orange-red light in its eyes. Desperate to complete the ritual before their chance slipped away, Elder Grizelda swung her sacrificial dagger, pointing the jagged blade directly at Ethan's chest. On the left, Lyra could only watch in absolute shock, her hands trembling with worry. But before the blade could strike, the stone stag statue underwent a dramatic transformation. Its eyes suddenly flashed with a brilliant, intense blue magical light, and thick vapor-like energy began to hiss from its antlers as the ancient stone began to crack open. A magnificent and massive spirit of the crowned stag materialized from the fractured stone, manifesting as pure, glowing blue energy. It stood majestically, in the center of a swirling runic ring, casting a brilliant light across the dark, rocky environment. From a bird's-eye view, a colossal beam of pure blue light erupted from the center of the sacrificial platform, shooting straight up into the stormy sky and dispersing a wave of mystical energy throughout the entire valley. Tied to the stone pillar, Ethan threw his head back and let out an agonizing scream as a concentrated pillar of brilliant blue light shot directly down into his forehead, causing his eyes to burst with a pure, blinding blue-white glow. The sheer force of the energy shattered his ropes, and Ethan fell forward onto the platform, weakened and head-bowed. Glowing blue tribal markings were newly etched onto his arms and shoulders, leaving Grizelda and Lyra to stare at him in absolute awe. When Ethan slowly lifted his head, his eyes burned with brilliant, intense blue energy. A glowing blue sigil of a stag with magnificent antlers had manifested, directly onto his forehead, pulsing in unison with the markings on his cheeks. Instantly, his vision shifted into a complex, digital-like blueprint grid. Red and blue lines overlaid his surroundings, mapping out structural nodes and physical data points in real time. As the overwhelming energy subsided, Ethan's eyes returned to their normal state, though the glowing blue tribal markings remained etched upon his face. His expression grew incredibly serious and determined as he assessed his new reality. Looking out at the gathered Blackwing tribe members, his new vision immediately picked up dark, smoky tendrils of red and black energy rising from their chests, indicating a severe parasitic infection spreading through their bodies. Digital blueprint HUD overlays flickered across Ethan's field of vision as he analyzed the structural and biological weaknesses of the camp. In the background, Elder Grizelda watched his quiet, calculated movements in stunned silence. Turning toward the young warrior who had defended him, Ethan looked at Lyra with a serious, inquiring gaze. Lyra clutched her hands together, her soft brown eyes searching his face with deep concern. Ethan spoke to her with quiet determination, laying out the raw facts of their survival. Lyra listened intently, her face reflecting a fragile mixture of worry and newfound hope. Behind them, Elder Grizelda fell heavily to her knees, looking up at the young human with an expression of immense guilt, awe, and complete submission, leaving her sacred skull staff discarded on the rocky ground. Across the wide altar platform, Ethan stood tall and completely free, while the High Priestess of the tribe knelt humbly before him on the stone steps, surrounded by the towering cliffs of the valley. The formidable Blackwing warriors and their children watched in stunned silence. Their previous hostility had vanished, replaced by a quiet mix of fear, shock, and a sudden deep-seated reverence for the human. Framed by floating blue particles of residual magical energy, Ethan stood calmly on the stone platform. Wearing his simple animal tooth necklace, he exuded a natural, authoritative presence that commanded attention. From the back of the camp, dozens of Blackwing warriors and citizens fell to their knees in unison, bowing their heads low toward the central stone altar, where Ethan and Lyra stood side by side. Reaching down, Ethan picked up the wooden staff as a symbol of his newfound leadership, with Lyra standing loyally by his side while the bright blue light of the monolith cast a protective glow behind them. Even the fierce warrior Barrett bowed his head, his stern, weathered face softening into an expression of deep respect and visible relief as he looked up at their savior. Lyra looked up at Ethan, her hands folded in a gesture of profound respect, her large eyes shining with admiration and relief that her instincts about him had proven correct. Suddenly, his mind reverted to a comical chibi perspective where a sweating Ethan stood scratching his head in complete confusion while a tiny elder, Grizelda, knelt in prayer, and the tribal children watched with wide eyes. Feeling incredibly flustered, the chibi engineer gestured wildly with blue question marks floating around his head, while a small, curious blue star-like creature floated beside him. But as he processed the situation, chibi Ethan quickly placed his hands on his hips with pride, thought bubbles of blueprints, hammers, gears, and bridges, popping up above his head as Grizelda and the kids looked up with hopeful eyes. He then looked toward Chibi Lyra with giant red hearts in his eyes, smiling broadly at her cuteness, though she merely stood there looking slightly indifferent to his sudden affection. Returning to reality, Ethan stood firmly on the altar beneath the massive, ethereal blue spirit of the crowned stag arching over the monolith, while every warrior in the camp bowed their heads to the floor. As the bright blue energy slowly began to fade, the dark sky cleared slightly over the rugged canyon. Lyra knelt humbly at the base of the platform, waiting for his first command. Looking out over his new subjects, Ethan's face hardened with determination, the glowing blue markings on his skin symbolizing his acceptance of his role as the tribe's savior. The kneeling tribe members, including Lyra, Elder Grizelda, and the weary warriors, kept their eyes locked on him, their expressions filled with a desperate, newfound hope. Elder Grizelda looked up with tears in her eyes, her face reflecting a deep mixture of guilt for her previous actions, profound reverence, and the hope that her people might finally survive. Ethan looked down at the desperate tribe with a calm, reassuring gaze, faint blue sparkles of magic still floating gently around his shoulders as he prepared to speak. Activating his blueprint vision once more, Ethan analyzed the entire camp, tracing the glowing blue lines of water flows and energy paths that ran beneath the dry ground. His glowing blue eyes focused sharply, displaying rotating digital circular patterns like advanced camera lenses as he scanned for critical structural vulnerabilities. Standing tall on the stone platform, Ethan looked down at the semicircle of kneeling tribe members, including Barrett, Grizelda, and Lyra, who waited breathlessly against the backdrop of the rugged cliffs. Lyra looked up at him, her large brown eyes wide with hope and curiosity, completely focused on the young human who had suddenly become their leader. Barrett listened intently to Ethan's firm words, nodding his head in serious agreement, ready to offer his formidable strength to whatever construction plans the new leader demanded. But as Ethan looked out over the crowd to begin his plans, a commotion near the center of the camp drew his attention, where a distressed mother was desperately cradling a small, limp child. The worried Orckin mother held her pale, unconscious fox-eared child, named Toby, close to her chest. Clutching a tattered leather water pouch, she looked up, toward the altar with a pleading, desperate expression. Ethan and Lyra dashed toward the center of the camp, where a distressed crowd had gathered on the rocky terrain under a gloomy sky. From beneath tattered leather awnings, other anxious tribe members watched with deep concern as the situation unfolded. Reaching the worried Orckin mother, Ethan stopped as she looked up with tears of deep sadness, desperately pleading for his help while holding a tattered leather waterskin. Ethan reached out to examine the container as the surrounding crowd looked on anxiously. Taking the dark leather waterskin, Ethan examined it with a serious, analytical gaze. Lyra leaned close over his shoulder, her face a mix of worry and intense curiosity as they inspected the contaminated contents. Under his enhanced perception, the liquid revealed its true nature. On one side, it was dark and heavily polluted with swirling red glowing particles and parasitic veins representing deadly blood silk orbs, contrasted against the clean blue water struggling to flow. Ethan's vision shifted into a deeper analysis mode as his eyes glowed with a faint red scanning energy, while the blue stag crest on his forehead and his tribal facial markings flared with bright divine light. Elder Grizelda leaned on her staff, looking down with a sad, helpless expression. Behind her, a warrior stood with a somber face, resigned to what they had always believed was an unavoidable curse on their water source. To illustrate their plight, Grizelda gestured to the earth where the contaminated water was spilled, causing dark black sludge and glowing red roots of the waterborne disease to spread outward in the mud. Ethan's eyes widened with sudden realization as he diagnosed the exact nature of the parasite. Behind him, two warriors, including the imposing bare-eared fighter, watched him with intense focus, hanging on his every move. Standing in the center of the camp, Ethan addressed the gathered crowd, gesturing dynamically as he explained his plan to build a multi-layered stone water filtration system to purge the parasites once and for all. Although skeptical, Barrett stood tall on the left while Ethan faced him on the right, both looking focused and determined to work together for the survival of the tribe. Barrett gazed out into the distance with a grim, proud, and determined expression, preparing to lead his men into the heavy physical labor required under the cloudy mountain sky. With newfound authority, Ethan addressed the rest of the tribe with an energetic and encouraging tone, motivating the listening warriors to prepare for the construction ahead. Ready to begin, Barrett's large, muscular hand firmly grasped a thick piece of carved wood, decorated with ancient tribal patterns, signaling the start of the heavy excavation. Nearby, Lyra's hands tightened around the hilt of her beautifully crafted, metallic bone sword, the blue tribal markings on her hand and shoulder glowing faintly as she prepared to guard the construction site. Lyra held her sword diagonally, pointing it forward with a sharp, protective posture to ward off any potential threats. Ethan stood close behind her, completely focused, while Barrett prepared his tools on the right. Ethan's blue tribal facial markings and forehead crest suddenly flared with brilliant energy as he began mapping out the exact coordinates of the filtration pits, drawing an intense, curious look from Lyra. Barrett focused his immense strength, preparing to shatter the hard, rocky ground, to clear the area as the first evening campfires began to flicker in the background. Standing within a glowing blue outline of energy, Ethan and Lyra looked down to guide Barrett's progress, their silhouettes framed by the twilight sky and the surrounding tents of the camp. Ethan clenched his fist with determination, shouting clear, precise instructions to the workers who were deeply motivated by his sharp and confident leadership. Pointing directly at a specific spot on the ground, Ethan gave quick directions to Lyra, who looked up with mild surprise while other tribal members worked, nearby on primitive wooden scaffolding. In the center of the bustling construction area, Ethan supervised the excavation, as Barrett and several strong, horned warriors dug out the deep settling pits, while Elder Grizelda watched with growing hope from the side. Elder Grizelda stood in the center of the camp, looking utterly amazed as she watched the massive warriors work together on the dry, sandy earth to build something completely foreign to their traditions. Ethan glanced over his shoulder with a sharp, serious gaze, ensuring that every detail of the construction was being executed flawlessly near the burning central campfire. Lyra turned to look back at the busy workers with a proud and satisfied expression, realizing that the tribe was finally uniting under a common goal, instead of preparing for a useless sacrifice. Wiping the sweat from his brow, Barrett looked stern but deeply satisfied with their progress, while the other exhausted tribe members took a well-deserved moment to rest against the tents. The entire area had transformed into a massive construction site, with dozens of tribal members working in a muddy trench to carry heavy wooden logs and sacks of stones to reinforce the newly dug water channels. Down by the riverbed, Lyra and another female warrior knelt on the ground, carefully sorting and packing smooth, rounded river stones into large woven sacks to be carried back to the camp. Near a roaring campfire, a tribal worker used a wooden stick to stoke the hot coals and produce high-quality charcoal, while Barrett sat nearby on a log, catching his breath. An overhead view of the site revealed deep, connected rectangular pools, carved directly into the clay soil. Barrett carried a large basket of stones to the edge, while Ethan pointed to direct the exact layering process. A worker carefully poured a large basket of crushed black charcoal chunks into one of the stone-lined chambers, packing it tightly over a pre-laid layer of small gravel. Leaning over the pit against the backdrop of the rocky cliffs, Ethan closely inspected the layers, ensuring the thickness of the filter beds met his precise engineering standards. A 3D digital blueprint overlay materialized in Ethan's mind, mapping the completed 4-tier terraced filtration system where contaminated water would pass through successive layers of gravel, charcoal, and sand to collect as pure water at the bottom. Gently touching the top of the filter bed, Ethan watched as glowing red scanning lines spread out under his hand, digitally testing the flow rate and efficiency of the system. Barrett stepped forward, carrying a massive brown leather water pouch filled with murky, raw river water. He stood over the newly constructed stone pool, while Ethan and the other warriors watched with bated breath. Ethan looked on with a calm and confident expression, completely trusting in the laws of science, while in the blurred foreground, Barrett prepared to tilt the heavy leather pouch. With a sudden tilt of his arm, Barrett poured the murky, dark-colored river water directly into the first stone chamber of the filtration system, sending a wave of polluted liquid splashing over the rocks. The top chamber quickly filled with muddy, stagnant water, but as it slowly trickled down into the chamber below, the liquid visibly began to clear, drawing gasps from the anxious onlookers. On a microscopic level, the heavily contaminated water trickled through the coarse gravel before entering the dense black charcoal layer, where the red glowing parasitic eggs were physically trapped and neutralized by the carbon. Within moments, the red contaminants were entirely stripped away, leaving only pure, healthy blue water molecules to flow freely through the final layers of the filter. At the edge of the final collection pool, a single, perfectly clear water droplet fell and glistened on a smooth stone, signaling the success of the miraculous device. The gathered tribe members, including the young fox-eared girl and the imposing Barrett, stared at the clear pool with wide, disbelieving eyes, while Elder Grizelda looked completely astonished by the miracle. Standing together over the collection basin, Ethan watched calmly as Barrett stared at the dripping, crystal-clear water with his mouth wide open in utter disbelief. Smiling, Ethan raised his hand and gestured for the big warrior to take a drink. Barrett stared at Ethan's hand in a daze, while behind them, Elder Grizelda watched the human with a look of profound, tearful respect. Ethan stood with a satisfied and resolute profile as Barrett finally leaned down to taste the pure water, while in the background, Grizelda's eyes. Pointing toward the newly constructed filtration pool, Ethan explained the crucial next steps to Elder Grizelda, who watched him with a mixture of surprise and intense curiosity. While the filtered water flowing steadily into the stone outlet was now visually clear, he explained that they still had to boil it to ensure it was completely sterilized of any microscopic pathogens. Elder Grizelda stared at him with wide, shocked amber eyes, completely amazed by this novel concept of boiling water to purify it even further. Behind them, a warrior kept watch in the blurry background as Ethan calmly detailed the process. Across the busy filtration camp, 2 workers carried a massive hollowed-out wooden tub to collect the clean water, while the rest of the tribe looked on from around the village. Nearby, piles of coal and stones remained prepared for future filter maintenance. Crystal-clear water poured steadily from the stone outlet into a wide wooden basin, managed by the careful hands of the tribal workers who were handling the precious liquid with extreme care. To achieve absolute purity, the water underwent a dual process, first passing through the coarse mesh filter into a stone basin and then being transferred to a large clay and bone pot set directly over a roaring fire where it boiled vigorously to destroy any remaining parasites. Ethan's expression grew tense and focused as the warm orange glow of the campfire reflected off his skin and highlighted his blue tribal markings. He waited anxiously, hoping this sterilized water would be ready in time to save the sick child. A worker's hands carefully placed another heavy wooden log onto the roaring campfire, sending bright sparks flying into the night air as they worked to maintain the high temperature needed to thoroughly boil the water. Ethan knelt quietly on the ground, holding a small wooden bowl filled with the warm, sterilized water. Beside him, the worried mother cradled her pale, fox-eared child Toby, who lay with her eyes closed as several concerned warriors watched in the background. The anxious mother gently encouraged her weak, dirty-faced child to take a sip, her hands trembling as she brought the bowl to the little girl's lips. With tears streaming down her face, the mother pulled her unconscious child into a tight, desperate hug, weeping silently as she waited in agony for the water to take effect. Ethan sat in somber silence, his head slightly lowered as he watched the mother and child huddled together, their figures illuminated by the bright glow of the campfire beneath a dark, starry night. The following morning, Elder Grizelda knelt by the stone filtration pool under the bright morning sun, carefully dipping her hands into the clear water to test its quality herself, while the other warriors gathered around. Her eyes went wide with shock and sheer joy as she looked at her wet hands, realizing that the water was indeed completely pure and entirely free of the parasite's deadly curse. Standing nearby with a clean piece of cloth, Ethan watched the tribe members gather around the morning fire, looking significantly happier, healthier, and fully recovered from their long illness. The camp erupted into pure celebration as a row of muscular warriors threw their arms into the air, cheering and shouting with joy to celebrate the miraculous recovery of their people. To demonstrate their new abundance of safe water, a worker used a large, green banana leaf to funnel a steady stream of clear, purified water onto the dry earth. Standing in line with the other warriors, Ethan looked calm and pleased, his eyes sweeping over the majestic rocky canyon that was bathed in bright sunlight. The dry and weary warriors eagerly took turns drinking the clean, sweet water from wooden bowls and leather skins, finally able to safely quench their thirst after weeks of dehydration. As Ethan walked through the camp, the grateful warriors followed closely behind him with filled water skins, looking at him with immense respect and admiration for his leadership. He paused and looked over at Lyra, whose glowing blue antlers were visible from behind, as they began to discuss the next crucial requirements for their long-term survival. Lyra turned to face him with a soft, serious expression, her dark hair framing her glowing blue antlers and slightly flushed cheeks, as she listened intently to his ideas. With his glowing blue forehead crest and cheek markings pulsing gently, Ethan explained with thoughtful determination that they needed to find high-quality clay to create durable, heat-resistant pottery. To find the material, Ethan and Lyra led a small scouting party of warriors through a rugged, rocky mountain valley, searching the surrounding hills for potential clay deposits. Spotting a promising area, Ethan knelt down on a patch of bright, orange-red clay soil, reaching out to feel its texture and moisture level between his fingers. Activating his blueprint eye, a white grid overlaid his field of vision, hovering over 3 chunks of the orange-red clay as blue energy lines analyzed its precise mineral and chemical composition. Looking pleased with the results, Ethan turned to Barrett against the backdrop of the sweeping orange-red clay hills, confirming that the earth here was absolutely perfect for making pottery. A worker's heavy leather boot stepped firmly into the wet, muddy red clay as the group began digging and harvesting the raw material. Barrett, Lyra, and the other warriors slung the heavy sacks of harvested clay onto their broad shoulders, making their way back along the dusty orange path toward the camp. Back at the camp, Ethan knelt in front of the pile of red clay, preparing to teach the curious tribe members how to properly refine and knead the earth while other workers dug in the background. The workers stomped and kneaded a large pile of the wet red clay on the ground, with their feet a critical step to remove any trapped air bubbles before molding could begin. Under Ethan's close supervision, Barrett used his massive, powerful hands to carefully press and knead a large mass of the red clay, adjusting his strength to avoid ruining the texture. Ethan then demonstrated the shaping technique, his hands expertly turning and smoothing a lump of wet red clay into a perfectly round pot. With a highly focused expression, Ethan carefully molded the delicate clay walls, while 3 tribal members watched in suspense and complete awe of his craftsmanship. He gently ran his fingers along the rim of the wet clay jar, smoothing out any imperfections to ensure a perfectly even shape. Barrett stared down with wide eyes, his face filled with complete wonder at how a simple lump of earth could be transformed into such a clean, functional tool. Ethan sat back against a stone wall, admiring a neat row of 5 newly molded red clay pots drying evenly in the warm breeze, before they were ready for firing. Once dried, a group of workers carefully placed the clay pots inside a large dome-shaped stone and mud kiln, with Ethan standing on the right to direct the delicate setup. Ethan and his workers stood before the massive mud kiln as a roaring fire was ignited inside the arched entrance, casting a bright, dancing light across the rocky cave shelter. As night fell over the cave camp, the large mud kiln glowed warmly with firelight, illuminating rows of raw clay pots set out to dry on wooden shelves in the background. Barrett watched the glowing kiln fire with a serious, deeply contemplative expression, fascinated by this incredible technological process that was unfolding right before his eyes. With his back turned to the camp, Ethan stood quietly monitoring the glowing kiln inside the cave shelter, ensuring the temperature remained high and stable throughout the night. Thick gray smoke began to billow gently from the exhaust hole at the top of the mud kiln dome, indicating that the baking process was proceeding exactly as planned. Exhausted but content after a long night of managing the kiln, Ethan sat resting against a stone wall outside the cave, enjoying a moment of quiet peace. A group of curious warriors and children, with Barrett among them, gathered outside the cave entrance, looking in with high anticipation as the firing process finally came to an end. Reaching his hands into the dark, cooling kiln opening, Ethan carefully retrieved the newly fired pieces of pottery. Ethan stood proudly before his people, holding a large, beautifully finished, dark, reddish-brown baked clay pot. As light steam gently rose from the ceramic jar, the entire tribe stared in absolute. Ethan stepped into the center of the camp, gently placing a warm, steamed reddish-brown clay pot on the ground. Around him stood several tribal members, including a tall warrior with deer antlers, a young girl, and other warriors who looked on with deep respect as Ethan displayed the finished ceramic vessel, proving they could now manufacture strong, waterproof storage. A close-up revealed 3 orc-kin warriors with deer features, their eyes wide and mouths agape in sheer shock and disbelief. They were utterly astounded that Ethan had created a rock-hard, waterproof vessel out of nothing but soft mud and intense heat. Barrett stood inside the cave, looking intently at the pottery. His rugged face bore an expression of serious concentration and profound respect as he realized the massive technological leap this ceramics production represented for their critical food and water storage. Nearby on a sturdy wooden shelf, several newly fired clay pots glowed warmly, under a soft amber light, showcasing the successful mass production of various sizes of these invaluable ceramic vessels. Elder Grizelda gripped her wooden staff, looking up with an expression of absolute awe. Tears of relief almost formed in her ancient, weathered eyes as she realized that Ethan's brilliant engineering had solved their storage and containment issues. Barrett bowed deeply before Ethan, his massive frame bent forward in a gesture of profound respect. In the background, Elder Grizelda watched with quiet satisfaction, while the glowing kiln fire on the right framed his absolute submission to their new savior. From the cave opening, a wide scenic view looked out over a vast, mist-shrouded mountain canyon. Ethan stood on the cliff's edge, looking over the landscape, where rows of finished clay pots were drying on mats, while several proud tribe members stood watching him from below. Lyra walked out of the dark cave toward Ethan, carefully carrying a warm, reddish-brown clay pot, filled with fresh, cool water to quench his thirst after a long day of labor. Ethan sat down on a nearby rock, looking up at Lyra as she gently presented him with the water. The two shared a quiet, gentle look, exchanging a rare and peaceful moment amidst the harsh realities of the wasteland. Sitting side by side on the rocky ground as evening fell, they shared the clay pot and looked out over the vast landscape, quietly discussing their hopes for the tribe's future and how to survive the impending threats. Suddenly, their quiet moment was interrupted. Lyra looked over her shoulder toward the mountain valley, where a group of dark, silhouetted figures was moving in their direction, prompting Ethan to turn and look as well. Ethan's expression immediately grew serious and alert. His blue tribal paint stood out sharply on his cheeks and forehead as he stared intently at the approaching travelers, preparing for potential danger. A colossal, heavily armored iron-horned rhinoceros walked slowly across the dusty, dry plain, kicking up thick clouds of dirt as a heavily laden merchant caravan finally arrived at the camp gates. Among the newcomers was a battle-scarred warrior with wolf ears and dark hair who leaned forward to rest his hands on a wooden spear, his eyes surveying the dusty tents and wooden fortifications of the Blackwing camp. Inside the camp, Barrett stood over a wounded warrior who slumped weakly on the ground. Under the cloudy sky, other armed warriors gathered in the background, receiving the grim warning that a foreign merchant group had just arrived. The wounded warrior looked up with a grim, battle-weary expression. In the background, Ethan and Lyra watched with deep concern as the scout weakly explained that the merchant group had arrived to trade under highly unfavorable terms. Grimacing in intense pain, the wounded scout detailed how the arrogant merchants had demanded an exorbitant and unfair tribute, while Barrett did his best to comfort his fallen comrade. Ethan and Lyra took their places prominently in the center of the gathered warriors, adopting serious defensive postures as they prepared to negotiate with the arriving merchants on their own terms. Under the bright sun filtering through the high cliffs, Lyra, Ethan, and Barrett carefully carried the wounded scout through the camp to get him proper medical attention. Near the wooden defensive spikes, a tense warrior drank deeply from a stone cup, preparing himself physically and mentally for a potential conflict at the camp's gates. Supporting the injured scout, Lyra, Ethan, and Barrett stood together at the front gates, looking out toward the dusty valley where the massive merchant caravan had ground to a halt. Ethan's eyes narrowed into a serious and analytical focus, mentally preparing himself to assess the merchant's physical goods and their true, hidden intentions. A group of tribal warriors, including several sharp-eyed women with animal ears, carrying bows and spears, marched quickly along a rocky path to reinforce the gates. Through the grand entrance of the camp, bordered by towering rocky cliffs, the narrow, sandy pass became congested as the White Fang merchant caravan slowly entered the canyon. At the front of the caravan stood Barton, a humanoid merchant with sharp features, long dark hair, and intricate snake tattoos coiling around his neck and chest. Standing before his heavily laden pack beasts, he wore a highly confident and smug expression. Elder Grizelda stood at the front, tightly holding her staff with a worried, defensive look. Behind her, Barrett and the other warriors stood on high alert, deeply wary of Barton's notoriously unfair trading practices. 3 massive iron-horned rhinoceroses marched heavily through the camp's wooden gates, carrying large leather saddlebags packed with rare, crude rock salt and grains. Looking down from his massive mount, Barton wore a haughty, arrogant expression as he loudly demanded an exorbitant and thieving price for their precious salt supply. Riding his brown horse, Barton sneered down at Barrett, who stood defensively in front of him, openly taunting the tribe's impoverished and desperate state. Barrett's battle-scarred face contorted with immense fury. Gritting his teeth, with a trace of fresh blood on his cheek, he struggled to contain his explosive rage at Barton's continuous insults. Standing face-to-face with a wolf-eared hunter from the caravan, Barrett adamantly refused the unfair and exploitative trade, standing firm for the honor of his people. To taunt them further, a merchant held open a small leather bag filled with coarse amber-colored rock salt crystals, using the vital resource as cruel leverage against the starving tribe. Barton held the bag of salt in his hand, offering it with a smug, mocking smile that made the coiling snake tattoos on his neck ripple with his silent laughter. Nearby, a group of Black Wing tribe members, including several women with fox ears, looked downcast and completely helpless, knowing they desperately needed the salt to survive but could never afford Barton's price. Standing defiantly in front of the wooden palisade wall, Barrett clutched his heavy club tightly, absolutely refusing to let his people be blackmailed by these vultures. A tribal warrior with deer antlers held his spear in a tense, alert grip, while 2 other warriors stood behind him in the shadow of the pines, prepared to fight if a conflict broke out. A wolf-eared warrior from the caravan smiled confidently, holding his spear loosely as the other merchant guards smirked at the tribe's apparent helplessness. Barrett stood prominently in front of his warriors, looking furious and defiant, as he loudly declared that the Black Wing tribe would never accept such a humiliating trade. Suddenly, the crowd parted as Ethan walked forward, carrying a dark, reddish-brown clay pot in his hands. Lyra followed closely behind him as the divine architect prepared to intervene. Ethan stood tall in the center of the confrontation, firmly holding his ceramic pot. Lyra and the other horned warriors flanked him as the sun peeked through the dusty clouds. Barton stared down at Ethan with a calculating, cold gaze, momentarily intrigued by the presence of this strange, confident human who dared to step forward. Lyra stepped protectively in front of Ethan, drawing her bone dagger with a fierce, alert glare, ready to strike down anyone who made a hostile move toward their leader. Barton suddenly burst into mocking laughter, finding the sight of a simple clay pot completely worthless compared to his precious bags of salt. Ignoring the laughter, Ethan tilted his clay pot, pouring a stream of clean, sparkling water into a small stone bowl, revealing his secret weapon, a highly concentrated, pure liquid salt brine. Barton's laughter instantly vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute shock. His eyes widened in disbelief as he realized the liquid was high purity, salt water, far superior to his dirty, amber-colored rock salt. The clear, pure liquid sat reflecting the sky and the surrounding tribe members on its surface. Ethan stood quietly, his eyes fixed on Barton, who gripped a heavy chunk of rough rock salt with tense concentration. Around them, Barrett and several tribal warriors watched the silent standoff, their gazes shifting to the stone bowl of crystal-clear brine sitting on the table, a silent testament to a power dynamic that had just shifted completely. Barton stared in utter disbelief at the salt resting on the table, his hand trembling as he realized his absolute monopoly over the region's salt trade had just shattered. Behind him, the deer-horned warriors of his caravan exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing that this small, seemingly defenseless tribe now possessed a method to obtain high-purity salt of their own. Knowing his leverage was entirely gone, Barton turned on his heel and began to march away in a hasty, defeated retreat. His guards lined up behind him, watching their leader walk away empty-handed after failing to secure the upper hand. Standing atop a cliff overlooking the canyon, Ethan watched in silence as the White Fang merchant caravan slowly departed. The massive, iron-horned beasts of burden lumbered down the dusty path, carrying the defeated merchants away from the Black Wing camp. Within the camp, Barrett stood with a somber, reflective expression, looking down at the ground while other warriors patrolled the wooden barricades. Even though they had successfully driven the predatory merchants away, Barrett knew the threat of survival remained unless they could secure a permanent, reliable way to produce their own salt. Ethan walked over to the anxious tribe members, his calm posture bringing a sense of reassurance to the crowd. Beside him, Elder Grizelda looked up with a glimmer of hope as Ethan confidently explained that they did not need to rely on merchants, as he could easily extract high-purity salt from the surrounding saline soil. Leaning on her staff, Elder Grizelda carefully inspected a small leather pouch of salt as Ethan stood beside her with a faint smile. He broke down the basic principles of salt extraction, explaining how the seemingly useless soil beneath their feet held the key to their survival. Pointing toward the open grounds of the camp, Ethan detailed his plan to construct functional salt pans and a dedicated refining station. The surrounding warriors listened intently, hanging on to every word of a process they had never deemed possible. Nearby, a worker's hands moved with practiced coordination, weaving together a strong green net bag using local fibrous plants to assist in the upcoming filtration process. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment before they snapped open, glowing with a vibrant blue magical light. As the intricate blue markings on his face lit up, he activated his blueprint eye, scanning the rugged landscape to locate the areas with the highest concentration of saline soil. Standing close to the cooking fires, a young fox-eared girl named Sienna held a small woven bag, her expression a mix of focus and anxiety as she prepared to help with the task. Ethan approached the center of the camp and spoke directly to Sienna, who knelt politely before him. With Lyra and Barrett standing by to assist, Ethan began giving instructions on how to properly collect and sort the raw, mineral-rich soil. Looking down at the young girl, Ethan explained the process of dissolving the soil in water, his voice calm and encouraging as Sienna listened with absolute focus, her hands clasped together. With Lyra, Barrett, and Sienna gathered around him, Ethan officially initiated the tribe's first salt production project, marking a turning point for the Blackwing tribe's self-sufficiency. Ethan turned and began walking toward the edge of the camp, looking back over his shoulder to guide the way. Sienna followed closely behind him, clutching a woven basket while the antlered warriors watched them depart for the harvesting grounds. A heavy boot stepped down onto the pale, crusty earth, cracking the thin layer of salt crystals that coated the ground of the natural salt pans they had reached. The small group stood together on the vast white salt, flat under a deep red sunset sky. Sienna carefully held open a large leather sack, already partially filled with the raw, coarse white crystals they had managed to scrape from the earth. Ethan reached down and scooped up a small handful of the rough, coarse salt crystals, closely inspecting their texture and mineral makeup before they began the refining process. The blue markings on Ethan's forehead glowed once more as he focused his vision on the raw salt in his hands, identifying the molecular impurities that needed to be separated. In his mind's eye, the layers of the salt flat were mapped out in a detailed geological cross-section, revealing the precise boundaries between the bitter, mirabolite minerals and the usable rock salt beneath the surface. Under the fading crimson light of the setting sun, Ethan, Barrett, and Sienna gathered the rest of their tools, preparing to haul the heavy sacks of harvested, raw salt back to the camp's newly designated refining area. Back at the workspace, a worker used a broad wooden shovel to carefully scoop the coarse white salt crystals, transferring them into a heavy, fur-lined leather bag for processing. Ethan stood alongside Lyra near the edge of the dry red clay flats, checking the quality and weight of the packed salt to ensure they had gathered enough raw material for the first major batch. A spacious outdoor refining workshop had been set up in the camp, complete with wooden tripods, large boiling pots, and basic filtration stations, all overlooked by a sturdy wooden watchtower. Ethan pointed toward a large ceramic pot resting over a hot fire, instructing Sienna on how to begin the crystallization process, while other workers tended to the boiling vessels in the background. Sienna stood close to the heat, gripping a long wooden paddle and carefully stirring the dissolving mixture as thick plumes of steam rose from the bubbling pot. The thick, pale liquid bubbled vigorously inside the heavy ceramic pot, swirling around the wooden paddle as the heat began to force the minerals to precipitate. To purify the solution, a worker carefully poured crushed dark charcoal into a woven cloth filter, creating a natural purification barrier to strip away any remaining organic impurities. Barrett knelt beside the furnace, carefully adjusting the wooden logs beneath the boiling pot to maintain a steady, high temperature as the steam swirled around him. Ethan stood in the middle of the bustling workshop, observing the progress of the outdoor salt pans on one side, while Barrett managed the fires on the other. Under Ethan's guidance, Sienna carefully poured the concentrated, thick liquid through a coarse cloth filter to strain out the remaining grit and clay. Ethan leaned in closer, showing Sienna how to verify the clarity of the dripping brine to ensure the filtration process was working effectively. Resting briefly on a wooden log, Barrett kept a watchful eye on the crackling fire, maintaining the intense heat required for the next phase of evaporation. Ethan stared intently into the steaming pot, analyzing the rising density of the liquid as it approached the critical crystallization point. Elder Grizelda watched with bated breath, her face filled with quiet intensity, as she waited to see if Ethan's foreign methods would actually produce real, edible salt. Ethan took a small pinch of the newly refined white powder from a wooden bowl held by Grizelda, rubbing it between his fingers to test its dry, powdery texture. Standing together in the heart of the workshop, Ethan, Sienna, and a nearby warrior watched closely as the very first batch of high-purity table salt began to settle. Inside the boiling pot, the water had nearly evaporated, leaving behind a beautiful layer of snow-white salt crystals floating on the surface of the residual liquid. Smiling with excitement, Sienna used a large wooden scoop to gently harvest the sparkling white crystals from the hot pot, setting them aside to dry. Illuminated by the warm, orange glow of the embers, Sienna's face shone with pride as she worked, her fox ears twitching happily at the success of her efforts. Ethan looked on with a warm, satisfied smile, proud of the young girl's dedication and the rapid progress the tribe was making toward self-reliance. In a nearby wooden-rimmed pot, clean water bubbled and boiled intensely, showing no trace of the bitter minerals or dirt that had once plagued their water source. Gesturing toward the dry, sparkling mounds of salt, Ethan formally announced the successful creation of their first high-quality salt reserves. As Barrett knelt to manage the last of the embers, Ethan gestured toward the final yields, explaining how they could replicate this process whenever their supplies ran low. Surrounded by the rising steam of the completed harvest, Ethan, Sienna, Barrett, and the rest of the warriors stood united, their faces. A roaring hearth fire blazed directly beneath the massive clay cooking pot, sending waves of intense heat upward. Following Ethan's direct command, Barrett knelt beside the flames and used his strong, calloused hands to carefully pull the burning logs away to let the mixture settle. As the intense heat subsided, a thick, sparkling crust of pure white salt, crystals, was revealed at the bottom of the pot. A thick, calloused finger gently reached out to touch the newly formed granules, testing the texture of the incredibly clean salt. Chief Silas and Ethan stood facing each other near the steaming vat, the tribal leader's face wearing an expression of absolute disbelief. Silas stared at the salt, unable to comprehend how Ethan had produced something so pure. Overwhelmed by the success of the process, Barrett dropped heavily to one knee in front of Ethan. He struck his chest with his fist in a traditional warrior's salute, his voice booming with deep respect as he pledged the allegiance of the Blackwing warriors to the seer. Ethan stood quietly under the simple wooden shelter, looking ahead with a calm and composed expression. While the tribe began to realize the gravity of this miracle, his thoughts were already focused on the critical steps needed to guarantee their long-term survival. Nearby, Barrett looked on with a serious, questioning expression, trying to understand their next move. Beside him, Lyra stood with her expressive eyes wide, with surprise, her attention entirely locked onto Ethan. A wide clay pot sat nearby, filled to the very brim with the refined, sparkling white salt crystals that gleamed under the warm light of the hearth fire. As the sun began to set, the entire Blackwing tribe erupted into a wild celebration around the campfire, raising their fists and weapons high into the air. Amidst the roaring cheers of "All Hail the Seer," Ethan stood calmly in the foreground, his expression thoughtful as he looked down. Lyra watched the unfolding celebration, her large, glassy eyes filled with quiet admiration and wonder. Her gaze remained fixed on Ethan, completely captivated by the leadership he had shown. Standing confidently in the middle of the rocky encampment, under a heavy, clouded sky, Ethan addressed the gathered tribe. He warned them of the impending beast tide that would arrive in 30 days, forcing them to remain confined within the safety of the camp. Suddenly, Ethan's analytical abilities activated, projecting a brilliant, blue and red holographic schematic over the ground as he began calculating the structural needs of a secure storage facility. Looking past Ethan's shoulder, a small group of tribe members, including Lyra, Barrett, Chief Silas, and Sienna, stood in a semicircle in the village clearing. They listened intently to Ethan's plans to build the village's very first smokehouse. Hearing her name called, young Sienna flinched, her large fox ears twitching with nervous energy. Her mouth parted in shock, and her eyes went wide with a mixture of fear and amazement as she listened to Ethan's sudden directive. Ethan stood tall in his rugged leather outfit, formally appointing Sienna as the master of the tribe's meat stores. Sienna bowed her head and upper body, respectfully, her bushy orange tail brushing behind her simple animal skin clothing. Under the warm glow of the night campfire, Ethan pointed authoritatively to assign the construction tasks to the warriors, while Sienna stood beside him. Work quickly began on a newly constructed open-air wooden shelter, designed to serve as a smoking and curing shed with sturdy roof beams and a central fire pit. Ethan stood in the clearing, with a serious expression, while Sienna stayed close, stepping in under the warm light of the setting sun. Ethan looked down encouragingly at Sienna as she stood in profile, holding a sharp bone knife as she prepared to make the first cut on the raw meat. Sienna concentrated deeply on her task, sweat dripping down her forehead. She slowly lowered the sharp bone tool toward the thick, parallel strips of raw red meat, searching for the right spot to begin her slice. As she hesitated, Ethan's guidance flowed down, overlaying a digital-like analytical matrix over the raw meat, showing the perfect lines of alignment for her fingers and the blade. Inside the preparation room, Sienna began carefully arranging the marbled meat strips on a wooden board, while Ethan stood close behind her, leaning over her shoulder to supervise her technique. Ethan leaned in very close, his face near hers as he whispered precise instructions on how to follow the grain, calming her nerves and steadying her hands. With her confidence restored, a wide, flat cleaver sliced through the large blocks of raw red meat, cutting them into perfectly uniform rectangular strips. Sienna's hands moved quickly, neatly aligning the freshly cut, highly marbled red meat strips side by side onto a large, vibrant green banana leaf. Lyra watched the entire demonstration from the side, her mouth slightly open in surprise and curiosity as she admired the incredible skill of Sienna's steady blade. A soft, humble smile appeared on Sienna's face as she successfully completed the delicate slicing process, her hair falling gently forward. Ethan looked back over his shoulder toward Sienna, his expression serious but encouraging as he prepared her for the next step of the curing process. A hand began sprinkling the fine, white, refined salt crystals over the rows of raw red meat strips, carefully rubbing the salt in to ensure every inch was covered. Sienna sat at a low wooden table, looking tired but deeply pleased with her progress as she finished salting the meat, a wooden bowl of refined salt sitting nearby. Outside, Barrett and several other strong, bare-chested tribal warriors worked together to lift and secure a heavy wooden log frame, constructing the sturdy skeleton of the smokehouse. Ethan stood in the golden afternoon light, raising his hand to check the alignment of the wooden structure and direct the construction workers. Sienna stood beneath the completed wooden frame, carefully hanging a large slab of cured meat onto a metal hook, while Barrett carried another heavy log to secure the facility. Inside the curing room, multiple slabs of red meat hung from hooks, suspended, high above the ground where the rising heat waves and smoke would dry them safely. A long, organized row of smoked meat slabs hung in a line, heavily enveloped in thick white smoke rising from the fire pit below. Down in the pit, the fire burned green pine branches and needles, producing a dense, fragrant cloud of white smoke that wrapped around the meat. Dozens of Orkin warriors gathered in the dirt clearing of the tribal village, carrying spears and organizing resources in preparation for the upcoming beast tide. A tall, imposing deer-featured warrior with large, dark antlers stood guard with a stern, weathered face, holding his spear as he kept watch over the camp's preparations. A young, animal-eared child looked upward with wide, curious eyes, staring in wonder and hope at the massive bounty hanging in the smokehouse. Chief Silas, holding his long spear, crouched down in the grass to inspect the progress of the curing shed, his expression filled with intense curiosity. The completed smoking hut stood open to the clearing, displaying rows of beautifully smoked meat hanging over a smoldering fire as bright rays of sunlight pierced through the pine forest. Chief Silas reached his hand out to touch one of the slabs of beautifully cured, dark, glistening smoked meat, verifying its solid texture. Using a unique bone-handled knife, Silas sliced a piece of the rich, cured meat to taste it while Ethan stood at the edge of the camp. A thin, glossy slice of thoroughly cured and dried dark red smoked meat was held up to the light. The deep, rich coloration showed how the moisture had been locked away, marking the success of the long preservation process. Elder Grizelda, the elderly High Priestess, carefully raised the cured meat to her lips. As she took her first bite, her eyes widened in profound astonishment and delight, her initial skepticism instantly melting away into absolute wonder at the incredible flavor. Standing in the center of the village courtyard, Grizelda raised her hand to the sky in pure amazement, her voice echoing as she held a large slab of the cured meat. Overhead, rows of preserved meat hung from wooden racks, surrounded by tribe members watching her reaction. Ethan stood calmly amidst the gathering crowd of tribe members, his expression relaxed and confident. Behind him, several Orkin warriors looked on in silence, waiting to see what their priestess's final verdict would be. The priestess raised her arm high in triumph, presenting the slab of cured meat to the heavens. Instantly, the crowd of tribal warriors erupted into enthusiastic cheers, celebrating around the smoking racks as hope returned to their hearts. Turning back to the group, Ethan spoke calmly to a tribe member standing nearby, his face illuminated by the warm, orange glow of the village hearth, which highlighted his blue tribal markings. Ethan stood beside Sienna, near a large wooden shelter filled with fresh pine branches. Sienna bowed her head in deep gratitude and respect, while Ethan looked down at his young apprentice with a gentle, encouraging expression, officially trusting her to manage the meat stores. As the main celebration continued, Lyra watched from the side while Barrett and a group of strong, antlered Orkin warriors walked confidently through the clearing, their expressions serious as they approached the seer. The entire village square joined in the celebration, with strong warriors raising slabs of the smoked meat into the air like hard-won trophies. Beside them, Sienna stood smiling happily, proud of what they had achieved together. Standing in the clearing with his companions, Ethan looked out over the village. While Sienna admired him and another warrior held a slab of cured meat, the massive timber frames of the newly built smokehouses rose prominently against the rocky hills in the background. Ethan's expression grew determined as he turned his attention to the next stage of preparation. Behind him, an elder warrior with curled horns and a gray beard watched silently, sensing the weight of the tasks ahead. Looking down at the gathering, Ethan and Barrett stood side by side as they were, surrounded by a crowd of thin, weary-looking Orkin refugees, who looked up at Ethan with expressions of newfound hope. 3 exhausted refugees peered through a wooden barrier, their thin, weathered faces showing a mixture of physical weariness and deep, profound hope as they stared at their savior. Inside a simple hide shelter, a group of impoverished refugees sat together, beneath a dark banner bearing a golden-winged crest, their tired eyes looking forward as they waited for direction. An elderly, battle-scarred Orkin warrior with a leather patch over his right eye leaned forward heavily on a wooden staff, his remaining eye locked on Ethan with intense focus. Spurred by Ethan's warning that the beast tide would arrive in 30 days, the group of refugees and warriors raised their wooden spears and tools in unison, rallied together by the one-eyed elder's fierce determination. The camp instantly transformed into a busy workshop as a craftsman's hands began, carving a wooden spear shaft using a small hand knife, carefully shaping the wood near a sharp bone spearhead. Nearby, a focused warrior with curled horns and blue facial markings bit down, hard on a thick hemp rope, using his teeth to tighten the knot as they bound the defensive weapons. Ethan stood calmly in the middle of the active outdoor workshop, supervising the tribal members as they carved wood, assembled weapons, and tended the fires against the backdrop of misty, pine-covered mountains. Barrett stepped forward, gripping a heavy stone-headed axe in both hands and swinging it downward with immense force and focus, testing the strength of their materials. Holding a wooden staff, Ethan faced Barrett in the dusty training yard to demonstrate a more effective spear-throwing technique, while a line of tribal warriors stood at attention behind them. Barrett looked at Ethan with a skeptical and curious expression, holding a heavy wooden club, as he tried to understand the science behind the seer's fighting methods. In the center of the training arena stood a thick wooden target dummy, tightly bound with heavy ropes and wrapped in protective animal fur. Barrett grinned fiercely, revealing his sharp fangs as he eagerly accepted the challenge to try out Ethan's physics-based technique. Standing in the training yard with his back to the camera, Barrett held a long wooden spear, targeting the fur-wrapped dummy in the distance, while Ethan watched from the side. Twisting his body to maximize leverage, Barrett threw his spear with immense force, tensing his muscles as he channeled the power of his arm. The spear flew with incredible speed, piercing clean through the thick animal hide armor of the training dummies and proving the sheer power of the modified weapon. Barrett turned back with a completely surprised and highly impressed expression, while several female warriors standing behind him gaped in utter disbelief at the weapon's destructive capability. Ethan stood calmly with a primitive spear, demonstrating its balance and design to the gathered warriors, explaining that leverage and force were matters of physics rather than magic. Holding a heavy wooden spear horizontally, Ethan presented it to Barrett and the other warriors, instructing them to prepare 30 of these upgraded weapons for the upcoming battle. Ethan pulled back a heavy wooden mechanism, his face focused and determined as he demonstrated how to modify their throwing tools for maximum velocity. A heavy metal-tipped spear penetrated deep into the center of a training dummy, wrapped in tiger print fur, splintering the thick wood under the immense force of the impact. A group of young Orkin warriors stood in absolute shock, their eyes wide and mouths agape as they witnessed the terrifying penetration power of the newly designed weapons. Barrett stared at the shattered target, his eyes wide and mouth slightly open in utter disbelief, as he struggled to comprehend what he had just seen. Ethan looked calmly at Barrett, who stood silently holding the newly reinforced wooden spear, while the other warriors stood in awe around them. Barrett held the newly crafted spear in his hands, staring down at its polished shaft and sharp tip with a mixture of reverence, wonder, and growing respect for Ethan's engineering. Ethan stepped forward and placed a reassuring hand on Barrett's shoulder, acknowledging his strength while Barrett looked down, completely humbled and grateful for the seer's guidance. Holding the new spear close to his chest, Barrett bowed his head slightly in a silent, solemn. A disciplined squad of Blackwing Orkin warriors stood in a tight, protective formation, clutching long, metal-tipped wooden spears, wearing dark leather armor. Their expressions were alert and tense as they guarded the camp outside a large rustic shelter, prepared for any threat that might approach. Inside the dimly lit, rustic workshop, Ethan leaned deeply over a large, round stone table. He was intensely focused on a complex tactical schematic drawn on a worn piece of animal hide, his sharp features illuminated by the warm, flickering orange glow of a nearby hearth fire. Ethan's blueprint eye activated, projecting a detailed glowing blue and red, holographic schematic of a massive mechanical weapon. The projection highlighted the structural layers, tension points, and complex trigger systems of the ballista he was designing to protect the camp. The complex blueprint zoomed in on a thick, curved wooden bow limb being drawn back under heavy tension. Glowing red energy lines flared along the natural cracks of the wood, illustrating the massive mechanical stress the frame would have to withstand during a launch. Ethan stood near the partially assembled, massive wooden bow mechanism, looking down thoughtfully as he planned the necessary structural adjustments. In the background, Sienna watched him with a mixture of worry and quiet support, surrounded by shelves of primitive tools. Turning to speak directly to Sienna, Ethan's expression was serious and questioning as they discussed the brittle nature of their current materials and how to handle the extreme tension of the bow limbs. To ease her growing anxiety, Ethan placed his hands reassuringly on Sienna's shoulders, looking directly into her eyes with a comforting expression. Behind them, a large tribal banner bearing the Blackwing crest hung proudly on the workshop wall. Suddenly, Lyra entered the workshop from the left, wearing her minimalist, dark leather armor. Her distinctive blue antlers caught the light as she looked toward Ethan with a calm, alert expression, ready to assist. From behind Lyra, Ethan and Sienna could be seen looking up, surprised and alert, as she stepped into the center of the workshop to join them in their discussion. Standing in the wooden doorway, Lyra presented a bundle of specialized, bound wooden shafts and reinforcement materials that she had gathered to solve the wood cracking issue. Moving outside into the daylight, Ethan stood in the middle of the camp, discussing the newly arrived components with Lyra, while rows of defensive spears and wooden scaffolding stood in the background. From a high angle, Sienna and a helper worked diligently at the round stone table to treat a massive curved wooden bow limb. They carefully wrapped it in leather and bound it tight with rope, surrounded by bowls of protective resins and oils. Sienna's face was filled with deep concentration and care as she carefully aligned the delicate reinforcement layers along the wooden bow limb, determined not to let the seer down. Lyra sat nearby in the workshop, mixing a bowl of warm, steaming adhesive resin to strengthen the newly bound limbs while Sienna watched her progress, learning the delicate craft. Strong hands wrapped thick hemp rope tightly around the curved wooden arm of the ballista, reinforcing its structural integrity to ensure it could handle the immense force of the draw. Ethan, Sienna, and Barrett worked in harmony to finalize the weapon. Ethan used a glowing blue transparent grid overlay to align the trigger mechanism, while Sienna applied a final coat of resin and Barrett stood watch nearby. The newly completed massive siege ballista, the Skybreaker, stood proudly in a dusty clearing. The giant weapon was aimed past the defensive spike walls toward the distant rolling hills. Barrett and a team of muscular warriors pulled back on thick wooden levers, winching the massive ballista's heavy bowstring into a cocked position, their faces strained with immense physical effort. The massive ballista was fully prepared for its test fire, with Barrett and his team working tirelessly at the rear, cranking the heavy wooden gears to lock the intense tension in place. Sweat poured down Barrett's face as he gritted his teeth in intense focus, applying his massive, bear-like strength to turn the heavy gears of the siege weapon. With a final push, Barrett and several other warriors pulled down hard on the massive wooden levers, their bodies tensed under the extreme physical strain. The heavy ropes and thick wooden spool of the winch creaked loudly, wound tightly to their absolute limit, and ready to release their immense destructive power. Suddenly, a colossal, heavily armored beast resembling a rhinoceros charged, forward at full speed, kicking up a massive cloud of dust as it ran toward their defensive wall for a live-fire trial. Ethan and Lyra stood side by side in the training yard, watching the charging monster. While Lyra looked alarmed and shocked by the beast's speed, Ethan remained entirely calm and focused. In the background, a group of Blackwing warriors watched the colossal beast's relentless charge, clutching their spears with wide, anxious eyes as the earth trembled beneath them. The armored rhinoceros charged directly toward their defensive line, its thick, scaly, stone-like hide and massive horn reflecting the harsh daylight. Standing ready beside the massive ballista, Ethan raised his hand and shouted out the order to fire, while Lyra watched the target in absolute suspense. Barrett gritted his teeth in intense concentration, his hand gripped tightly around the wooden release lever as he prepared to trigger the firing mechanism. Under a darkening, stormy sky, Lyra stood near the front to signal the target, while the giant Skybreaker stood aimed directly at the charging armored beast in the distance. A strong hand pulled back hard on the release lever, triggering the giant ballista and releasing the stored mechanical tension. With a deafening twang, the massive wooden bolt struck the thick armored scale of the rhinoceros-like beast, sparking with brilliant light as it shattered a piece of the rock-like armor. The immense force of the impact knocked the colossal armored beast backward, sending it crashing into a large boulder and kicking up a huge cloud of dust and debris. Lyra looked on in absolute shock and awe, her mouth slightly open in amazement at the weapon's power, while Ethan stood quietly in the background, fully satisfied with the Skybreaker's success. Unbeknownst to the tribe, the entire test was being watched through a primitive bone telescope, its crosshairs focused directly on the massive ballista in the clearing. Peering over a rocky ridge, a Crimson-Hoof scout, with red horns and blood red markings around his eyes, watched the devastation. His face was tense and sweating as he witnessed the weapon's terrifying capabilities. Terrified by the power of the Skybreaker, the scout quickly pulled back behind the rocks, his expression filled with sheer panic and alarm. The scout bolted across the wide, rocky canyon, running at full speed through the desolate terrain to return to his tribe. Desperation and panic were written all over the scout's face as he ran as fast as his legs could carry him. Under a dramatic, cloudy sunset sky, a lone scout ran at full speed across the vast plain toward the massive wooden palisades of the sprawling tribal fortress, carrying urgent news of the developments within the camp. Ethan stood near the high wooden battlements of the fortress, gazing off into the distant horizon under an overcast sky. His expression was serious and contemplative as he monitored the defensive lines and watchtowers. An advanced technical schematic overlay analyzed a rugged canyon pass nearby. A glowing red energy source shone at the top of a high cliff, surrounded by floating white crystalline structures and geometric scanning lines to map the terrain. Ethan stood in the foreground with a look of quiet determination, while the massive, fully assembled Skybreaker siege ballista sat ready on its wooden tracks behind him, its heavy rope pulleys and reinforced frame primed for defense. As night fell over the village, Ethan stood outside a cozy wooden log hut, looking down with a pensive expression. The warm, flickering orange glow of a nearby brazier illuminated the dark surroundings, reflecting his exhaustion. Wearing his distinctive bone-spinal cord back armor, Ethan pushed open the heavy wooden door to enter his hut, the warm firelight from the hearth spilling out into the cold night. The moment he stepped inside, Ethan froze in absolute shock and disbelief. His eyes went wide, and his mouth parted slightly as he stared at the completely unexpected sight waiting for him. Inside the cozy room, A warm fire crackled in the central hearth, illuminating 4 young Orckin maidens sent by the High Priestess. Lyra, Sienna, a horned warrior maiden, and a red-haired fox-eared maiden stood waiting for him in quiet anticipation. Lyra looked downward with a soft, embarrassed blush, coloring her cheeks. Her pointed ears and elegant blue markings stood out in the warm firelight as she fidgeted nervously. The horned warrior maiden stood with her arms crossed, looking serious and resolute on the left, while the red-haired fox-eared maiden stood on the right, smiling warmly and expectantly at their seer. Ethan stood completely flabbergasted and overwhelmed by the situation, sweat, beads forming on his forehead as he stared in disbelief at the girls. The 4 maidens stood closely together in the dimly lit room, watching Ethan with a mixture of curiosity, shyness, and silent expectation. Outside the hut, Elder Grizelda, the High Priestess, leaned in and peeked, through a narrow crack in the wooden door, a knowing and highly satisfied smile on her wrinkled face. Grizelda intensely peered through the gaps in the wooden boards, closely monitoring the situation inside to make sure the seer accepted their offering. Pressing her hand flat against the rough wood, the High Priestess leaned her head close to the door, eager to eavesdrop on their conversation. In an adorable chibi illustration, a panicked chibi Ethan clutched his head and cried comically, while a screaming red alarm clock and giant exclamation marks hovered in the air beside him. Meanwhile, chibi versions of the 4 maidens stood in a neat row under floating pink hearts, looking incredibly cute and smiling happily. Chibi Ethan cried and sweated profusely, a giant blue teardrop forming on his forehead as he tried to figure out a way out of his predicament. Outside, under a bright blue chibi sky, Chibi Grizelda clasped her hands, together, weeping tears of pure joy as she imagined the future of the celestial, forged bloodline. Chibi Ethan sat dejectedly on a log by his fire, while the 4 chibi maidens watched him from the right, and Chibi Grizelda kept peeking through the doorway. Determined to establish order, Chibi Ethan put on a yellow construction hard hat and held up a wooden sign painted with the characters for rules and standards to set strict boundaries. The 4 chibi maidens looked on, their faces falling into expressions of disappointment and confusion at the seer's unexpectedly strict regulations. Under a smiling crescent moon, a simple blackboard-style diagram appeared, explaining the safety concepts of maintaining a respectful distance from a weapon-wielding seer. Accepting the terms, the chibi maidens brightened up and smiled cheerfully in a row, happy to cooperate with his rules. Returning to the realistic style, the horned warrior maiden crossed her arms and spoke firmly to Ethan, while the red-haired fox-eared maiden watched them with a look of mild concern. Sienna stood in front of a wooden wall adorned with hanging bones, holding a thick rope and offering a gentle, humble smile as she prepared for her duties. A close-up revealed Lyra's midriff, decorated with winding blue tribal tattoos, and a thick leather belt adorned with bone and bead accessories hanging around her waist. Sienna, Lyra, and the red-haired maiden stood in a neat row inside the busy workshop, looking toward Ethan with expressions of absolute determination and readiness to work. Lyra stood in the wooden doorway, casting a focused, serious gaze back over her shoulder as she prepared to head out to her post. Elder Grizelda looked deeply serious, her face filled with pleading urgency as she explained to Ethan the vital importance of protecting their home. Ethan and Lyra stood outside the log hut, looking toward Grizelda with firm, resolved expressions, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. A wide aerial view showed the bustling campyard active with construction and salt processing, featuring smoking structures, wooden barricades, and large boiling vats spread across the dirt ground. The strong-horned warrior maiden grunted with heavy exertion as she carried a massive pine log on her shoulder across the busy construction site. The red-haired fox-eared maiden stood high atop a tall wooden watchtower, keeping a vigilant eye over the vast sunlit plains. Sienna stood near a wooden board, carefully carving tally marks to manage and update their resource inventory, while a muscular wolf-eared warrior stood guard beside her. A group of 3 muscular Orckin warriors, led by the red-haired fox-eared maiden, marched through the village while pulling a heavy cargo cart loaded with supplies. Suddenly spotting danger from his post, Barrett gripped a large wooden mallet, tightly poised to strike a heavy bronze warning bell to alert the tribe. A massive cloud of dust rose in the canyon pass as the Crimson-Hoof cavalry, mounted on fierce, predatory beasts, charged down the dusty canyon at terrifying speed. A fierce Crimson-Hoof warrior, riding a dark, horned war beast, shouted a battle cry as he raised his long spear high into the air. Elder Grizelda looked out at the approaching dust cloud, her face freezing in sheer terror and panic as she recognized the threat. Inside the village, Blackwing warriors scrambled in panic and alarm as the surprise raid began, with smoke and fire starting to rise in the background. Two mounted Crimson-Hoof raiders rode aggressively into the center of the camp, looking down with hostile grins right next to the large clay jars of refined white salt. The storage yard was filled with neat rows of valuable clay jars containing white salt, with strips of cured smoked meat hanging from the wooden frames. Overhead, a crowd of Blackwing warriors gathered near the fortress watchtower, facing the mounted Crimson-Hoof invaders in a tense, silent standoff. Chief Silas stood firm on foot in the courtyard, staring up defiantly at the Crimson-Hoof leader mounted on a black horse, surrounded by anxious tribal warriors. Hidden from immediate view, the massive Skybreaker ballista sat fully loaded with a heavy, iron-tipped wooden bolt aimed directly toward the entering raiders. The powerful, red-horned Crimson-Hoof commander looked down at Silas with a cold, superior expression, demanding their salt, water purification methods, and the seer himself. A line of defensive warriors, including a horned deerkin and a wolf-featured warrior with glowing red eyes, stood with their weapons drawn, ready to fight to the death. Barrett let out a furious shout, his face twisting in rage, as he prepared to lunge forward to defend his home against the invaders. A hand quickly drew a curved bone dagger from a leather belt decorated. Lyra kept her eyes locked onto the approaching Crimson-Hoof chief, her entire body tense and defensive as she watched him ride in from the distance. The threat was imminent, and she knew any sudden move could ignite a devastating conflict. Chief Silas grit his teeth, a deep-seated anger burning in his eyes as he stared at the invaders. The scar running over his eye twitched with the memory of past battles, fueling his absolute defiance and refusal to back down. Standing firmly at the center of the defensive line, Silas refused to show weakness, flanked closely by Ethan and Lyra as they confronted the hostile force. Behind the towering Crimson-Hoof chief, a massive army of mounted raiders lined up across the dusty canyon, their numbers dwarfing the village's defenders. With the odds heavily stacked against them, Silas and his companions were forced into a tense negotiation beneath the heavy cloud-covered sky. The giant Crimson-Hoof chief raised his massive, spiked metal club high into the air, barking commands to his eager army to intimidate the villagers. Beside him, his elite cavalry commanders sat motionless on their horned mounts, holding their long spears high with cold, disciplined precision. The massive invading force pressed close to the village's wooden walls, ready to tear down the fortifications at their leader's command. From the shadows of a wooden shelter, Ethan watched the tense standoff, calmly, calculating his next move and preparing to present his strategic defense plan. Stepping onto the edge of the wooden wall, Ethan pointed directly at the massive army, completely unfazed by their overwhelming numbers. He stood directly before the giant chief, looking up at the mounted leader with an analytical, completely fearless expression. Ethan gestured toward the massive Skybreaker ballista mounted on the high battlements, catching the attention of the observing warlord. He then showcased their advanced water purification system, explaining how their technology made the village self-sufficient and heavily fortified. With absolute confidence, Ethan spoke directly to the enemy leader, making it clear that any attempt to take this territory would cost them dearly. Above the complex trenches and fortifications, a brilliant white holographic blueprint materialized, displaying an intricate, automated defense grid. The Crimson-Hoof chief stared in sheer shock, completely unsettled by the technological power this supposedly weak tribe possessed. Ethan stood proudly beside the devastating siege weapon, demonstrating that the village was no longer a helpless target. Realizing that a direct assault on this highly advanced fortress would result in heavy casualties, the warlord was left with no choice but to reconsider his plans. With a tense growl, the Crimson-Hoof chief pulled back on his reins, turning his massive mount around to lead his elite cavalry away from the village gates. Silas, Ethan, Lyra, and Barrett stood side by side on the walls, watching the massive army slowly retreat down the narrow canyon pass. As they withdrew, Ethan's eyes glowed with a brilliant blue light, activating his blueprint capability to analyze the enemy's movements and gear. Though the immediate threat had passed, Ethan and his close allies remained, vigilant, knowing this peace was only temporary. As night fell, the massive Skybreaker ballista stood silent on the battlements, with Barrett keeping a watchful eye over the dark horizon. Ethan looked up at the cloudy night sky, his mind focused on the challenges and battles that lay ahead. Lyra stood in quiet contemplation, the heavy burden of their survival weighing on her as Ethan and Barrett remained close behind. Meanwhile, at the enemy camp, the Crimson-Hoof chief stood before a roaring campfire, outlining a stealthier plan to his loyal commanders. Pulling a dark leather hood over his head, the chief's face grew grim and intensely focused on his plan to infiltrate the village. Under the cover of the stormy night sky, two shadowy figures slipped quietly, through the narrow, rocky canyon pass toward the settlement. Sensing danger, Lyra crouched low beneath a thatched shelter, clutching her bone dagger as she listened to the sounds of the night. High on the battlements, a sentry stood guard next to the massive ballista under the cold light of the full moon. The Crimson-Hoof chief slipped past the outer defenses, gripping his spiked club tightly as he sneaked into one of the dark wooden buildings. He paused and turned around, a confident smirk spreading across his face, believing he had successfully bypassed their defenses. Suddenly, an armored warrior pushed hard against a heavy wooden gate, trying to lock the intruder inside. The Crimson-Hoof chief stood in the dark doorway, his watchful expression hardening as he realized he was no longer undetected. In an instant, a massive spiked trap crashed down onto the floor, kicking up a thick cloud of dust around the intruder. Up on the high wooden battlement wall, Lyra peered down through the stormy night, her twin daggers held ready for combat. With a swift motion, Lyra dropped onto the wooden platform in a low combat stance. Locking her eyes on the giant chief, she lunged forward in a blur of speed, while the Crimson-Hoof chief's body erupted with a brilliant, orange-red spiritual energy. The chief raised his weapon, his eyes and horns glowing under the dark, stormy night sky. Lyra stood poised in a combat stance on the wooden platform, staring down the towering Crimson-Hoof chief. Her blue antlers caught the faint light as she prepared for the lethal duel. The clash was instantaneous and violent, with bright sparks illuminating the dark as Lyra met the chief's heavy blows. He swung his massive spiked club with brutal force, forcing her to rely on her swift reflexes to survive. Sliding backward defensively across the platform, Lyra tightly gripped her sharp bone dagger, watching the chief's glowing red eyes of rage as he delivered another heavy swing of his club. Her face was flushed with the intense exertion, her glowing blue antlers reflecting her unwavering focus as she locked onto her opponent's next move. Nearby in the shadows, Barrett worked quickly behind the massive firing mechanism of the village's primary ballista, checking the gears and heavy ropes to ensure it was primed for release. Loaded with a thick, sharp wooden bolt, the giant weapon stood aimed directly at the village gateway, ready to unleash devastating force on any invaders attempting to break through. As the defenses held, two mounted Crimson-Hoof raiders panicked and fled from the village gates, their horned mounts kicking up dust under the dark sky. Left alone in the center of the village courtyard, the Crimson-Hoof chief stood, defiantly with his massive club, illuminated by the burning torches flanking the wooden battlements. He grit his teeth in intense frustration, his elite warriors standing guard in the darkness behind him as their initial assault stalled. Lyra raised her bone daggers in a defensive guard, flanked by two spear-wielding Blackwing warriors as they kept the furious chief surrounded and contained. Stepping into the light, Ethan stood calmly among his people, his blue tribal markings faintly glowing under the dim light as he prepared to address the hostile leader. The chief stood tense and ready, his surviving raiders gathering behind him on the dark battlefield, waiting for the signal to strike or retreat. Holding a wooden spear, Ethan stood his ground while Sienna watched anxiously from behind as the two sides began to discuss the terms of their survival. The tense negotiation unfolded in the center of the clearing, with the Blackwing defenders on one side and the heavily armed Crimson-Hoof raiders on the other under the stormy night sky. Nearby on the ground lay a heavy leather backpack, partially open to reveal a unique horned helmet and other valuable armor components brought as bargaining chips. The Crimson-Hoof chief glared at Ethan with pure rage, his hand gripping his spiked club so tightly his knuckles turned white. Ethan remained completely calm and resolute, backed by Barrett, who stood quietly to his left, showing no fear of the giant warlord. The two leaders faced off across the illuminated village square, surrounded by their respective forces as the burning torches cast long shadows. Standing in front of the towering wooden ballista, Ethan and Lyra looked down at the Crimson-Hoof chief, making their defensive advantage clear. Ethan spoke with calm authority, outlining the devastating consequences the invaders would face if they chose to continue their path of senseless violence. Down in the canyon, a heavily armored predatory mount snorted and breathed heavily, its glowing orange-red eyes cutting through the rising dust. Realizing they needed greater numbers, the Crimson-Hoof clan gathered their forces, and soon a massive line of cavalry began charging down a dusty mountain pass under a blood-red sunset sky. From high on the village battlements, Ethan stood firmly, watching the massive cloud of dust kick up in the distance, with a serious, unwavering expression. At the foot of the battlements, a heavy leather-wrapped bundle lay on the muddy ground, containing the essential materials for the traps they were about to deploy. The Crimson-Hoof chief shouted in absolute fury at his commanders, refusing to believe that a tribe of mere refugees possessed weapons capable of piercing his forces. Standing tall beneath his massive canvas war banner, the warlord rested his spiked club on his shoulder, determined to assemble his elite 100-man cavalry to flatten the village. With red banners fluttering in the wind, the heavily armored cavalry charged across the wet, muddy plains, heading directly for the Blackwing village. Leading the charge, a fierce commander pushed his armored beast to its absolute limits, his eyes locked onto their target with deadly intent. The sheer scale of the assault was staggering, as the tightly organized army of raiders thundered forward, kicking up a massive cloud of dust across the valley. To mask their advance, the charging cavalry released a massive wall of thick red smoke, blanketing the battlefield in a crimson shroud. At the front of the formation, the Crimson-Hoof chief screamed a powerful battle cry, his face contorted in pure, unbridled rage as he led the charge. On the battlements, Ethan activated his blueprint vision, projecting a glowing blue digital firewall and scanning grid over the fortress wall to analyze the incoming threat. The futuristic interface mapped out the entire canyon, highlighting the cliffs in blue geometric grids and marking the enemy's exact path of attack in a stark red line. Earlier, Ethan and Barrett had stood in the sandy valley below, marking the ground with dotted white lines to establish their primary tactical defense zones. The strategic plan relied on a network of underground caverns where stone pillars had been weakened so they could be triggered to collapse under the weight of the charging army. Looking down into the deep defensive trench, Ethan verified the placement of the sharp wooden stakes and large clay pots that Lyra had carefully arranged. Rows of massive clay jars filled with highly flammable oil were positioned securely behind the dirt wall, ready to turn the trench into a blazing barrier. Ethan's expression remained exceptionally calm and focused, his hand hovering near the mechanism that would unleash their carefully prepared traps. High on the wooden platforms, two newly constructed dual-lever ballistas stood ready, their massive frames aimed toward the foggy mountain peaks. Sienna looked at Ethan with deep worry, but his tranquil demeanor reassured her that every variable had been accounted for. With a look of fierce determination, Sienna used all her strength to turn the heavy iron winch, pulling the massive ballista's thick cord back with a sharp click. At the top of the guide rail, a massive steel-tipped spear lay loaded, with a group of determined female warriors standing by to release the weapon. Sienna gasped as she looked out over the field, while Ethan calmly monitored the advancing forces, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At the front of the defense line, Ethan stood before the massive wooden gate, under a heavy sky, flanked by Barrett, Lyra, and the village elders. Lyra crossed her arms confidently, standing alongside Barrett with his massive stone battle axe and Sienna, all prepared for the final clash. Suddenly, Ethan's eyes ignited with a brilliant blue glow as he spotted the lead. Raiders standing silently upon the high battlements of the village, Ethan looked down into the deep, rocky canyon pass. The silence of the morning was shattered, as the distant rumble of the approaching enemy forces echoed through the valley. Beside him, Chief Silas stood with a furious, gritting expression of absolute determination, tightening his grip on his weapon as he prepared his warriors for a brutal defense of their home. Far below, a high aerial view revealed the sheer scale of the threat, with a large, tightly organized block of Crimson-Hoof infantry marching down the center of the narrow canyon valley. Suddenly, the Crimson-Hoof cavalry surged forward, raising their blood-red banners and kicking up a massive, blinding storm of dust as they charged at full speed through the pass. At the vanguard of the assault, the giant Crimson-Hoof chief screamed in a wild battle rage, his voice echoing off the canyon walls as he led his troops directly into the defensive zone. Mounted on his heavily armored black beast, the enemy warlord galloped at breakneck speed across the dry, rocky ground, completely confident in his overwhelming numbers. From his vantage point on the high battlements, Ethan's perspective shifted as a blue holographic scanning grid materialized before his eyes, highlighting the charging cavalry with flashing red indicators as they headed straight for a massive hidden sinkhole. The blueprint map in his vision focused on the critical structural support, highlighting the weakened underground stone pillars directly beneath the path of the oncoming invaders with red collapse indicators. With the weight of the charging cavalry pushing the terrain to its absolute limit, the ground suddenly fractured and collapsed into a massive crater, instantly swallowing the vanguard of the charging raiders. Ethan watched the devastation unfold, his blue tribal markings faintly visible on his skin as his eyes narrowed in a cool, calculated focus, ensuring the trap's activation went precisely according to plan. Despite the sudden loss of their front lines, the remaining Crimson-Hoof riders continued to press forward through the thick dust cloud, entirely unaware of the next trap lying directly in their path. Suddenly, the earth gave way once more beneath the galloping horses, triggering a massive landslide that swallowed the charging raiders into a deep, inescapable trench. Refusing to be stopped, the giant Crimson-Hoof chief leaped high into the air from his rearing horse, raising his massive spiked club to deliver a crushing blow. As his boots slammed into the earth, a colossal red tiger spirit manifested, behind him in a blinding crimson light, with glowing magical sigils and ancient runes erupting around his feet. His muscles bulged with raw spiritual power, and his eyes glowed a bright, ominous red as the massive tiger spirit roared behind him, preparing the chief to charge the fortress walls entirely on his own. Backed by the towering spectral predator, the warlord charged forward on foot, leading the remaining wave of his infantry in a desperate bid to breach the gate. Seeing the enemy advance, a group of Blackwing warriors worked in perfect unison, pulling heavily on the ropes to trigger a massive wooden log mechanism on the fortifications. High on the cliffs, a massive, heavy boulder balanced on the wooden log lever was suddenly released from its resting place. Multiple giant boulders rolled down the steep canyon walls with a thunderous roar, crushing the advancing enemy forces and kicking up immense clouds of dust. Yet, the relentless Crimson-Hoof raiders pushed through the chaos, continuing their charge even as the falling rocks crashed violently around them. Several riders raised their heavy spears, screaming in defiance as they surged forward to breach the final line of defenses. However, their momentum carried them directly into a hidden defensive trench, heavily lined with sharpened wooden stakes and fragile clay oil jars. The cavalry was instantly trapped inside the deep, V-shaped trench, their horses struggling and falling over one another in the narrow ditch. Left on foot, the Crimson-Hoof chief and his surviving commanders looked around, in sheer frustration, realizing they were completely surrounded by the village's defensive network. Before they could react, a round clay jar filled with highly volatile explosive oil was hurled from the battlements, hurtling through the air toward the trapped raiders. The jars shattered and exploded violently inside the trench, unleashing a massive wall of raging fire and thick gray smoke that completely enveloped the enemy soldiers. Behind the raging flames, the Blackwing warriors stood in a tight, impenetrable shield wall formation, their sharp, metal-tipped spears held ready to repel any survivors. Through the thick smoke and embers, the giant red tiger spirit of the Crimson-Hoof chief let out a weak, desperate roar, but the battle was already decided. With one of his eyes glowing with the brilliant blue light of his blueprint, vision, Ethan calmly raised his hand, signaling his warriors to finish the battle. A massive ballista bolt, fitted with an explosive, fire-wrapped pot, was launched from the battlements, cutting through the smoky air with a sharp hiss. The bolt struck the center of the canyon, unleashing a colossal explosion of fire and light that completely obliterated the remaining enemy forces. A massive fireball rose high into the sky, casting a bright orange glow over the retreating and burning raiders who scattered near the wooden watchtowers. The battlefield fell quiet, revealing the grim aftermath of scorched earth, smoldering fires, and the scattered, defeated remains of the Crimson-Hoof vanguard. Lyra immediately charged across the smoke-filled battlefield, her bone dagger drawn, as she pursued the fleeing survivors with incredible speed. She clashed with a giant enemy commander, effortlessly dodging his heavy strike, before delivering a swift, decisive blow that brought him down. With their forces decimated, the remaining Crimson-Hoof warriors, including their formidable chief, dropped their weapons and knelt on the cold ground in surrender. In a powerful display of submission, the defeated army knelt before the village altar, fully acknowledging the overwhelming power of the Blackwing tribe and their divine architect. Chief Silas stood proudly over the defeated enemy, a fierce grin showing his fangs, as his warriors raised their voices in a roaring cheer of victory. Standing atop the high battlements near the massive watchtowers, the Blackwing tribe raised their fists, their shouts of triumph echoing across the canyon. Amidst the ecstatic celebration, Ethan stood calmly in the middle of the crowd, looking out over the valley with a serene, deeply thoughtful expression. Sometime later, far from the village, a bright blue light flashed in the distance of a dark, rocky mountain pass, indicating a mysterious new discovery. As they investigated, they found a lone white antelope standing on a rocky hill, its body covered in pulsing, parasitic red growths and swollen veins. An extreme close-up of the infection revealed the horrific reality of the blood silk curse, with pulsing vine-like veins carrying hundreds of glowing spherical red eggs. Ethan and Lyra looked down at the diseased creature, their faces pale with deep shock and a chilling realization of what this meant for the region. They looked out over the desolate, rocky wasteland, which was now bathed in the eerie, blood-red light of an ominous sunset. Standing side by side, Ethan and Lyra stared up at the changing sky with serious, worried expressions, realizing that an even greater apocalyptic threat was rapidly approaching. Back in the village, a group of young warriors, including a horned deerkin, raised their hands and cheered, unaware of the looming danger outside their walls. With his blue tribal markings glowing faintly, Ethan looked forward with a highly serious, determined expression, his mind racing to prepare for the coming storm. On the battlements, Lyra and Chief Silas stood together, their expressions turning to absolute shock and deep. Standing resolutely upon the elevated wooden platform, Ethan looked down at his gathered people with a serious and calm expression. Behind him, the dark, dramatic storm clouds rolled heavily across the sky, setting a tense tone as the backs of the Blackwing tribespeople, including Lyra with her distinct blue antlers, remained focused entirely on his words. Turning back, Ethan gazed out towards the horizon from the edge of the platform, where a colossal, glowing blood-red moon dominated the sky. Partially obscured by crimson-tinted clouds, the rugged mountain landscape stretched endlessly into the twilight, emphasizing the vast scale of the impending danger and his lonely vigilance as a leader. Deep in the dark mountain range, the massive red moon cast a crimson glow over the jagged, steep peaks. Swirling black clouds framed the valley as a small flock of birds flew frantically through the pass, fleeing the desolate, threatening environment. A primal bone talisman, crafted from animal skulls and curved rib bones lashed, together with thick vines, hung silently from a gnarled, moss-covered tree branch. In the blurry background, the dark stone and wooden battlements of the tribal fort stood under the menacing sky, representing a culture deeply rooted in spiritual survival. Inside the fortified courtyard of the camp, several horn-featured tribal men wearing tattered hide clothing stood in confusion and growing concern. The defensive wooden spike walls loomed behind them, while banners fluttered violently in the hot wind bathed in the eerie red light of the crimson sky. High Priestess Elder Grizelda stared out with wide, apprehension-filled orange eyes, her wrinkled face and white tribal markings painted on her forehead, highlighted by the ominous glow. She could sense a dark omen in the air, a threat unlike anything the tribe had faced before. Near the meat-hanging racks, several wolf-eared villagers crouched in deep concern, their gazes fixed on the heavy defensive walls of the camp as the blood-red sky loomed overhead, reinforcing their absolute vulnerability. Across the dry, cracked earth of the courtyard, dozens of tribal villagers knelt and bowed on all fours in sheer despair and fear. Surrounded by hanging meat, carcasses on drying racks, their posture of submission showed they were facing a crisis they could not overcome on their own. Elder Grizelda sat directly on the parched ground, looking up with an expression of complete hopelessness as the massive blood moon and swirling red clouds enveloped the watchtowers and defensive barricades of the camp in a terrifying fiery glow. Suddenly, Ethan's eyes ignited with a brilliant, glowing blue energy, reflecting the image of the crimson blood moon in his pupils. Intricate blue tribal markings lit up his cheeks, and a stylized blue stag sigil shone brightly on his forehead as his mystical blueprint abilities fully activated. Through this enhanced sight, an apocalyptic vision unfolded inside his pupils, revealing a dark, multi-tiered fortress surrounded by flowing rivers of glowing red energy beneath a massive, menacing crimson moon. Grizelda quickly approached Ethan, holding his forearms in a desperate plea for hope as she looked up with tears in her eyes. Ethan, dressed in his sleeveless animal hide tunic and claw necklace, looked down at her with a calm, reassuring, and determined expression. With the blue tribal markings on his cheeks glowing softly, Ethan looked directly into the priestess's eyes, exuding a quiet confidence that showed he was ready to guide the tribe through the coming storm. Stepping to the center of the camp's main circular platform, Ethan established himself as the central tactical leader of the tribe, with Grizelda standing respectfully behind him while the remaining villagers knelt in quiet deference under the swirling red sky. Standing together as a united front, the tribe's key leaders, Chief Silas, Ethan, Lyra, and the massive Barrett, stood side by side looking forward with absolute determination while a crowd of warriors gathered behind them. With his facial markings pulsing with energy, Ethan began directing defensive operations, pointing out of frame as he spoke with urgency. Lyra stood close, behind him, her cheeks flushed as she listened with absolute focus and trust in his design. Chief Silas let out a fierce battle cry, raising his heavy wooden spear high into the air as his muscular arms and bone necklaces framed his intense war cry against the dramatic, swirling crimson clouds. Silas stood elevated on a wooden platform in the center of the camp, addressing the horn-featured and wolf-eared warriors kneeling before him, rallying his people to prepare for a battle of survival. The courtyard instantly erupted into a flurry of activity as tribal workers ran across the dusty ground, with strong warriors carrying massive, heavy wooden logs on their shoulders toward the outer walls to reinforce their defenses. From a high wooden scaffolding structure built against the stone walls of the fort, Ethan looked down to oversee the rapid construction, watching as workers carried lumber to secure the battlements. Inside the dark, rocky shelter of the limestone cave, two male tribespeople worked diligently in the warm firelight, hanging long strips of cured meat onto wooden drying racks to secure their food supplies. Sienna, the young fox-featured girl, worked focused and serious inside the cave shelter, using her steady hands to tie a thick hemp rope around a wooden support pillar, proving her worth as Ethan's technical apprentice. Chief Silas stood guard at the wide, arched entrance of the cave, holding his long spear defensively as workers behind him organized large clay storage pots and prepared the cave to serve as a secure shelter. The cave interior was quickly transformed into an organized storage facility, with racks of dried meats and clay jars filled with salt and grain arranged, neatly near a small fire, while Sienna carried a heavy sack across the partitions. Outside, several muscular bare-featured warriors led by Barrett carried heavy cloth sacks of provisions on their shoulders, dropping them in neat rows within the camp courtyard under the ominous red sky. In the construction area, workers began lifting large, rectangular stone blocks, transitioning their simple wooden fortifications into sturdier, long-lasting stone structures. Under the giant glowing red moon, the entire community worked together on a massive stone and clay structure, carrying bricks, pulling ropes and raising walls, according to Ethan's engineering designs. Barrett and other strong warriors worked in perfect coordination, lifting and precisely positioning heavy stone blocks onto the rising defensive walls. Ethan used a piece of white chalk to draw precise architectural alignment lines on the rough stone, applying his modern engineering knowledge directly to the tribal construction. Nearby, a wooden paddle was used to stir a thick grayish mortar paste inside a hollowed-out wooden bucket, preparing the essential binding materials for the walls. A wide wooden brush applied a thick layer of the gray mortar onto the brick and stone structures, securing the defensive wall against any physical impact. Strangely, several small, glowing red beetle-like insects began crawling up the brick wall, moving toward the freshly applied white paste under the fiery red sky. Over the following days, the painstaking work continued as workers painted the mortar over the bricks while more red beetles scattered across the wall, with wooden tubs lined up under a gradually clearing blue sky. As night returned, the bustling construction site remained active under the massive red blood moon, with villagers tirelessly carrying heavy materials to complete the multi-tiered stone fortifications. A pair of hands carefully adjusted heavy, riveted metal plates onto a thick wooden platform, integrating advanced metal reinforcements into the tribe's wooden mechanisms. Sienna crouched on the wooden drawbridge structure, looking down with a serious and concentrated expression as she adjusted the heavy iron fittings, while warriors assisted with thick ropes. Suddenly, Ethan looked forward with wide, alert eyes, his blue cheek markings glowing as he sensed an abrupt shift, while other tribespeople looked on behind him with shared concern. A close-up of the newly completed wooden drawbridge revealed its advanced, telescoping design made of interlocking wooden slats that could fold and unfold seamlessly. The completed high stone and wood fortifications stood proudly under the dark red sky, with scaffolding and remaining sand piles lining the base of the massive defensive wall. Inside, a hand held a charcoal stick to draw an intricate, glowing blue schematic on a surface, mapping out a complex network of defense lines and energy flows designed by Ethan. Looking down along the outer base of the massive wall, a deep defensive trench ran parallel to the fortifications, where fires burned to produce. Smoke and fire rose silently from the deep defensive trenches dug just outside the grand, completed fortress wall. Reinforced with heavy iron trim and mounted shields, the massive structure stood silhouetted against the twilight, while burning braziers cast a warm, protective orange glow down toward the barrier below. A wide shot of the camp revealed the sheer scale of the stone and wood, fortifications stretching across the canyon, with scaffolding still clinging to the tallest walls. Overhead, a turbulent, blood-red sky swirled with crimson clouds, dominated by a glowing blood moon that illuminated the settlement's defensive readiness. Nestled securely within the massive stone fortifications, a large, heavy wooden door sat slightly ajar, letting a warm and welcoming glow escape from inside the village. Flanked by burning torches on stone pedestals, the entrance proudly displayed the white-winged crest banners of the Blackwing tribe. High on the ramparts, several massive wooden ballistas sat primed on rotating bases, guarded by horned Blackwing warriors standing vigilant against the ominous red sky. In the background, grand Chinese-style pagodas and watchtowers loomed, showing the rapid and complex expansion of the city's defenses. Exhausted from the relentless pace of construction, Ethan sat wearily on the wooden platform of a ballista mount, resting his forehead against his hand to ease his heavy burden. Behind him, 2 armored guards carrying spears paced along the battlements under the fiery sky, keeping a watchful eye on the perimeter. Lyra approached quietly to comfort him, gently placing her hand on his shoulder, while offering him a wooden bowl filled with cool water. Ethan looked up, his blue tribal markings catching the light, and offered a weary but grateful smile to the young warrior. Standing together by the battlements, Ethan spoke softly of his worries, wondering if his relentless demands had made him look like a madman to his people. Lyra, her bright blue antlers and soft brown eyes catching the firelight, listened with undivided devotion and absolute trust in his vision. Gazing thoughtfully into the distance, Lyra reflected on how the seer had rescued her from a dead end, her rosy cheeks and delicate gold earrings, highlighted by the distant lights of the fortified city and the rising blood moon. In a quiet, intimate gesture, Lyra gently placed her slender hand over Ethan's rugged grip, their leather wrist wraps and bone ornaments brushing against each other as she silently pledged her life and her totem to his cause. Lyra looked down shyly, her cheeks flushing a soft pink as her deer ears pointed downward, savoring this rare, quiet moment of vulnerability and deep connection with the man who had redefined her destiny. Sitting side by side on the cold stone battlements, the two held hands as the massive, glowing blood moon hung directly between them in the dark, crimson sky, offering a fleeting moment of peace before the onset of war. A close-up of their hands revealed their tight, protective grip, with Lyra's wrist decorated with her blue tribal tattoo, resting securely within Ethan's larger hand as a silent vow of shared strength. Facing each other, they shared a gentle smile in profile, their silhouettes bathed in the warm, crimson glow of the giant moon, which framed their promise to dance the first Phoenix dance once their city was finally secure. Suddenly, the peaceful atmosphere shifted as Lyra looked forward with a surprised, alert expression, while Ethan's face hardened under the tense, red-lit sky. An abrupt, fiery yellow explosion burst from a defensive mechanism on the ramparts, the sudden flash of fire and sparks illuminating the dark stone walls and shattering the quiet night. A horned lookout warrior holding a spear spun around in sheer shock and panic, his eyes wide with terror as he ran along the battlements to sound the alarm that a threat was fast approaching. Silas, Ethan, Barrett, and Lyra quickly lined up along the ramparts, their expressions turning grim and determined as they stared out under the massive red moon, bracing themselves for what lay ahead. Ethan immediately activated his blueprint eye, projecting a glowing blue wireframe schematic across his field of vision that mapped out the terrain and detected a massive movement of life signs against the crimson background. Out on the parched, cracked plains below, a desperate crowd of Crimson-Hoof refugees, recognized by their small red horns, ran frantically for their lives, clutching young infants to their chests in absolute terror. Looking down from the high battlements, the defenders witnessed a horrifying sight as an overwhelming red-glowing tidal wave of fiery beasts surged across the barren plains, threatening to swallow the fleeing refugees. At the rear of the desperate crowd, the battle-scarred Crimson-Hoof chief walked, slowly down a smoking rocky ravine, bloodied and holding a serrated bone sword as his people struggled behind him. Once, a disciplined line of Crimson-Hoof warriors with curved red horns had defended their own grand temple fortress, but their former strength and territory had now completely collapsed. Now, the weary and injured remnants of the tribe knelt in the smoky ravine, looking up toward the closed gates of the Blackwing Fort in a desperate search for sanctuary from the oncoming horde. On the wall above, Barrett and another muscular warrior looked down with wide, surprised eyes, their anger flashing as they remembered how these same people had driven them out just 30 days prior. Several deer-featured defenders stood highly alert on the battlement, shouting and pointing down at the pleading refugees as the tribe debated whether to grant them entry. The Crimson-Hoof chief, his face soot-stained and heavily scarred, looked up at the high walls with a mixture of pride, sorrow, and weary resignation, pleading, not for himself, but for the innocent children. With a heavy sigh of defeat, the giant chief dropped to his knees in the dust, driving his massive bone sword into the ground as a solemn sign of unconditional surrender. He grit his teeth in deep frustration and humility, bowing his head to accept his defeat and submit entirely to the authority of the Blackwing protectors. Chief Silas looked down from the stone wall, his face showing a mix of caution and stern respect, noting that while their history was bitter, the Crimson-Hoof possessed exceptional earthwood construction skills. Ethan stood alongside Silas, looking down at the long, desperate column of refugees below, and made his decision to allow them entry while discussing their placement and integration into the tribe. Through his analytical vision, Ethan scanned the marching host, mapping out the rocky terrain under the red moon with glowing markers to ensure there were no hidden threats or infected individuals among them. Within the city courtyard, a glowing blue grid projection activated over the stone ground, projecting wireframe sentries to maintain strict order as the refugees were ushered inside. As the massive stone gateway was outlined in a glowing blue projection, a vibrant burst of red energy flowed outward, sealing the entrance with a powerful defensive barrier to lock out the approaching beast tide. With the gates sealed and his forces unified, Ethan looked forward with a calm, resolved expression, his blue tribal markings glowing. Standing atop the high stone battlement in front of a massive stone wall, decorated with a large carved horned mask emblem, Ethan pointed his finger, commandingly down toward the valley. Behind him, thick iron chains hung along the stone structure as he began laying out his strict conditions to the defeated raiders. Outside the fortress, the defeated Crimson-Hoof warriors immediately complied, tossing their bone-claw daggers, heavy axes, and curved shields into a massive pile near the river canal, the weapons splashing loudly as they hit the wet ground. From a high-angle wide shot of the rocky canyon, rows of Crimson-Hoof warriors knelt on the ground with their hands behind their heads in a formal act of submission. Nearby, a heavy wooden ballista remained manned by Black Wing guards, keeping them securely under watch. A low-angle close-up focused on heavy iron chains resting on the damp earth as the defeated warriors knelt in the background, accepting their bound state as the high price of their survival. On the ramparts, Ethan continued pointing forward with an authoritative, serious gaze, while Chief Silas stood closely behind his left shoulder, watching the unfolding surrender with silent, intense focus. Among the surrendered clan, a group of Crimson-Hoof warriors, including a young girl with bright red horns, looked upward at their new leaders with expressions of deep concern, resentment, and quiet submission. Chief Silas watched them with stern vigilance, the fresh battle scars on his face, highlighting his contemplation as he oversaw the integration of their former enemies. With their complete submission established, Ethan looked down with a calm, reassuring, and benevolent smile, indicating his willingness to welcome the surrendered clan as Silas and the other tribe members stood behind him. At the center of the wall, Ethan stood flanked by Chief Silas on his left and the Crimson-Hoof chief on his right, as the latter bowed his head deeply in respect to cement their new alliance. The Crimson-Hoof chief held his head low, his dark, wild hair tied back by decorative bone beads, his single red horn pointing forward as he offered his proud but necessary submission to save his tribe. In a symbolic gesture of surrender, the massive, ornate, bone-trimmed sword of the Crimson-Hoof chief lay flat on the stone deck before Ethan and Silas. The kneeling Crimson-Hoof chief looked up at Ethan, his left eye glowing with a fierce orange-red light, showing that while he had submitted to protect his people, his warrior spirit remained unbroken. Standing proudly, the muscular Crimson-Hoof chief allowed his ornate bone sword to be strapped back onto his side, signaling his reinstatement as a commander, under Ethan's leadership to defend the wall. The chief then turned back to his vast tribe, sweeping his arm outward to direct them, to move quickly toward the safety of the city walls, while massive horned war beasts stood prepared to assist in the evacuation. A massive pile of surrendered weapons, axes, and shields lay along the river canal just outside the grand stone walls, which were now decorated with banners, bearing the character So representing the beasts. The Crimson-Hoof chief knelt on one knee in front of his gathered tribe, as refugees, men, women, and children with red horns, stood close behind him, looking forward with hope as they prepared to enter their new home. A massive crowd of unified refugees and warriors stood outside the grand stone gates, waiting as plumes of white smoke rose from the trenches, showcasing the immense scale of the new coalition. Inside a dark storage cave, Sienna stood before shelves filled with clay jars, her large fox ears twitching as she prepared the decontamination protocols near, a wooden sign reading "Dealing with Insect Eggs." A female tribal doctor with red horns held a large wooden brush, preparing to disinfect the incoming warriors with white powder, while large clay pots and supply bins lined the cavern walls. Using a wooden stylus, Sienna carefully documented the intake protocols on a hanging slate tablet reading "Chonwan Indwe," establishing a systematic method to treat the infected. Inside the busy shelter, warriors carried sick children and moved supplies, demonstrating the organized medical care established to heal the refugees. From a low angle, Lyra was seen running at full speed toward the massive wooden city gates, accompanied by two horned warriors as the heavy doors slowly began to close. Lyra's face showed extreme urgency, her deer ears pulled back and her blue antlers glinting, as she barely slipped through the narrowing gap of the main gate. Outside the fortress walls, the massive wooden drawbridge was raised by heavy chains, while the remaining guards ran inside through the narrowing gap of the main stone gatehouse. Lyra pressed her back flat against the closed, metal-reinforced wooden gate panels, catching her breath with a terrified look, knowing the danger was now right outside. On a rocky ridge outside, the Crimson-Hoof chief stood alone under a giant, blood-red moon, holding his massive bone sword high against the thick, menacing clouds. A terrifying pack of monstrous war beasts, including a white wolf with glowing red eyes and armored black rhino-like creatures, charged forward across the barren earth. The Crimson-Hoof chief grit his teeth in rage, his eyes glowing with gold energy, as he prepared to unleash his power against the oncoming monsters. The armored, rhinoceros-like beasts charged through a wall of thick gray smoke, their scaly hides and heavy horns prepared to ram the city's defenses. On top of the city walls, Barrett used his immense strength to crank a heavy, iron winch mechanism on a massive wooden ballista, while Ethan stood in the background, calmly overseeing the weapon's alignment. Ethan's eyes glowed with a powerful, intense red-gold light, and veins of energy pulsed around his cheeks as his tactical sight mapped the battlefield. Through his vision, a massive, swirling red eye in the clouds sent waves of blood-red energy crashing down, clashing directly with a protective barrier of brilliant blue lightning and energy rising from the city's defenses. Below, the barren plains were covered in a massive, crawling black tide of countless insects and parasites rushing toward the city, creating a terrifying threat. The pack of giant, wolf-like beasts and scaly rhinos charged at high speed toward the grand stone walls under the dark crimson sky. Lyra stood on the ramparts, pulling back on a heavy rope mechanism with all her strength to cock another massive ballista, her expression focused and determined. A giant, spear-sized wooden bolt, loaded onto the weapon, was engulfed in bright, roaring flames, ready to be launched. The projectiles fired, and a massive wall of fire erupted across the dry dirt plains, creating a barrier of bright orange flames and thick gray smoke to block the advance. A high-angle view looking down at the battlefield showed a long, continuous line of fiery explosions cutting across the landscape, successfully dividing the charging beast army and protecting the city walls. Despite the fire barrier, a second wave of wolf beasts and armored rhinos continued their relentless charge toward the high stone gates under the red moon. Torches burned brightly along the battlements of the completed stone wall, and a dense protective smoke screen rose from the deep trench to obscure the defenders. A young, weary deer-featured female warrior spoke with a male warrior on the wall, her expression filled with relief as the flames burned in the background, confirming the defense was holding. From behind, Lyra, Ethan, and another female warrior stood on the battlements, looking out at the massive wall of fire that stretched across the plains, keeping the beast tied at bay. Safe inside the cave shelter, the Crimson-Hoof chief looked out cautiously from the entrance alongside other red-horned members of his tribe, checking if the city walls had held. The Crimson-Hoof chief and his warriors watched the distant battlements with intense focus, their faces lit by the warm glow of torches inside the rocky cavern, in absolute awe of the seer's work. Ethan stood triumphantly amidst the bright, roaring flames against the dark, red-tinged sky, capitalizing on his engineering and fire to hold off the monstrous tide. Suddenly, a tremor shook the stone floor beneath a warrior's powerful, muscular legs, and a low, ominous A middle-aged horned warrior stared outward, his face pale with an anxious, shocked expression as the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. Behind him, in the dusty, amber-lit background, Barrett and the other tribal defenders watched with growing concern, sensing that their current defenses might not be enough to withstand the incoming force. Looking out from the high stone battlements, the defenders could see the massive wall of roaring orange flames temporarily holding back a vast, endless horde of red glowing beasts. However, the sheer size of the approaching army beyond the fire line presented a terrifying challenge that fire alone could not solve. Ethan's face was highly focused, his expression hardened with absolute determination, despite a minor battle scratch beneath his right eye and the small blue tribal markings painted on his cheek. In the blurry background, Chief Silas and the other warriors looked on, relying entirely on Ethan's next command to save them. From behind a colossal, armored, scale-backed beast, a terrifying variant of the iron-horned rhinoceros, the true horror of the invasion was revealed. Its back was lined with sharp, dark, rocky spikes, and in the distance an entire army of these massive, armored creatures charged across the plains under a dark, red-tinged sky. The colossal armored beast let out a deafening, earth-shaking roar directly toward the city walls, swirling rings of sonic wind energy forming around its maw, as its throat glowed with a dangerous, crackling red light. Under the immense impact of the beast's sonic shockwave, severe structural cracks began to snake across the large stone blocks of the city wall, with dust and smoke puffing out, threatening to breach the fort's main defense. Barrett watched in sheer shock and alarm, his teeth bared and his rugged bearded face tense, as he witnessed the sudden structural failure of their newly built stone wall. Lyra stood on the battlements, looking out at the advancing threat with a mixture of fear and defiance, while Barrett and the other warriors behind her stood ready, their expressions grim as they prepared for a potential breach. A massive wooden spear launched from a standard ballista struck the hard, scaly hide of the giant beast, producing a massive shower of sparks but failing to pierce the thick, rocky armor. The thick wooden shaft of the giant ballista bolt snapped and shattered into pieces mid-air, with splinters flying in all directions as it bounced harmlessly off the creature's near-invulnerable hide. Barrett stood near the ballista mechanism, his face filled with shock and frustration as he realized their primary defensive weapons were completely ineffective against the colossal threat. Lyra looked up with a worried, helpless expression, her eyes wide and her cheeks flushed as the despair of the defenders deepened with the failure of their weaponry. Ethan and Lyra stood together on the wall, sharing a tense moment as Lyra looked at him with deep worry, while Ethan, wearing his animal tooth necklace, remained calm and contemplative, searching his mind for a solution. Inside the spacious, dark storage cave shelter, the cavern was quiet and empty, of people now with dried meats hanging on racks, clay storage jars lining the floor, and quiet fires burning, serving as a secure refuge for the non-combatants. Ethan's focus intensified, and both the glowing blue stag sigil on his forehead and the blue tribal markings on his cheeks shone brightly as he prepared to activate his specialized vision. Through Ethan's blueprint eye perspective, a blue high-tech HUD with targeting reticles and scanning grids mapped the battlefield, targeting the giant armored beast outside the gate and highlighting its projected attack path in red. The scanning interface highlighted the colossal beast with a glowing purple outline, carefully analyzing its structural composition to identify a critical weak point beneath its rocky armor plate. Deactivating his tactical sight, Ethan's expression shifted from deep analysis to absolute resolve as he formulated a plan to defeat the creature. Lyra ran quickly toward Ethan on the battlements with an urgent, worried expression, while fires burned on the platforms behind them to highlight the chaotic battle. Barrett looked back at Ethan with a tense, questioning expression, waiting for a command or a new strategy to save the collapsing wall. Ethan dashed past him toward a grand wooden pavilion and control tower built atop the city walls, where warm orange lanterns hung from the eaves under a dramatic red sky. Beneath a fabric shroud, a massive advanced ballista weapon was mounted on a circular stone platform, the entire weapon glowing with intricate, bright blue runic symbols as the massive blood-red moon rose behind it. The intricate runic carvings along the side of the advanced ballista glowed with a brilliant blue light, charging the metallic and wooden frame with immense energy. Inside a grand stone workshop, Sienna ran forward carrying a glowing blue crystalline energy plate, with Ethan and other tribal elders standing ready to load the power source. Loaded onto the guide rail was a magnificent, highly detailed silver spear, its metallic body glowing intensely with blue runic carvings, ready to deliver a devastating strike. Two hands carefully placed a glowing silver protective plate decorated with a blue glowing stag head emblem onto Ethan's chest, preparing him for the final phase of the battle. Ethan's eyes glowed with a brilliant, pure blue energy, and the blue stag sigil on his forehead shone brightly, showing his full synchronization with the weapon's power. The massive runic ballista, fully charged and humming with bright blue energy, aimed directly toward the colossal threat outside the gates. A pair of hands slid the glowing blue stag head plate into a matching slot on the control console, locking it into place to activate the weapon's primary firing sequence. A row of 7 smaller, glowing blue runic plates were loaded into slots along the base of the control console, humming with divine energy. The metallic shaft of the loaded spear began rotating and charging, surrounded by swirling trails of bright blue light and energy as it primed for launch. Elder Grizelda stood in the foreground, looking up with an expression of profound awe, hope, and spiritual reverence, as other tribal members watched the glowing weapon, their faces illuminated by the blue light. The heavy wooden gear and pulley mechanism creaked under extreme tension as the massive ballista was drawn back, ready to release its payload. The massive charged runic ballista stood ready on the wall, with a giant counterweight stone block hanging behind it to provide the necessary thrust. The giant silver projectile loaded in the runic ballista was surrounded by a swirling vortex of blue wind and energy as the final charging phase completed. Outside, the massive armored beast stood directly in front of the stone city, walls under the red moon, preparing to ram the gates with full force. A close-up of the giant beast's face revealed a thick collar around its neck, glowing with a bright red, crackling energy matrix, indicating it was controlled by a dark, hostile force. Within the mechanical chamber, Ethan held a massive, heavy stone-headed hammer, wrapped in ropes, looking forward with a fierce and determined expression as he prepared to strike the trigger mechanism. He slammed the hammer down, and the thick, twisted ropes and runic carvings on. The massive runic ballista glowed intensely as the weapon released. The giant silver runic bolt launched into the night, leaving a powerful trail of... The massive stone walls of the newly constructed fortress stood firm, heavily reinforced with thick steel protective plates and runic symbols along their base. Surrounded by a thick shroud of smoke and fog, the architecture proved its immense strength against the horrors of the wasteland. A massive silver projectile, glowing with a brilliant blue energy, tore through the sky from the left. It penetrated the fortified iron gates of the fortress. Under the dark sky, dominated by a giant, blood-red moon that cast an eerie light over the entire battlefield. The silver runic bolt head pierced straight through the outer defensive energy barrier with blinding speed, producing a brilliant white and blue flash of lightning and intense kinetic force upon impact. Cutting through a massive, roaring wall of flames, the projectile generated a violent shockwave of yellow-orange fire as it flew with absolute precision toward its final target. The colossal iron-horned rhinoceros stood directly outside the stone city walls, under a dark, stormy sky, roaring in agonizing pain as the devastating runic spear struck its exact weak point. With the beast finally neutralized, the dust cleared to reveal a massive breach in the stone fortress wall where a large section had collapsed into a pile of rubble. The black banner reading Black Wing Fort hung loosely on the remaining stone tower, surrounded by heavy smoke. A wide-angle view of the battlefield showed the massive beast tied completely, split into two halves by a scorched path of dirt created by the fiery wall of defense, stretching out toward the distant red moon on the horizon. Inside the fort, Ethan stood in the center of the grand, multi-tiered pavilion platform, holding his massive hammer. He was surrounded by towering wooden columns and structures that had successfully withstood the intense shockwaves. Ethan looked down in deep thought, his face cast in heavy shadow as he wore his elaborate animal bone necklace, silently processing the immense weight of the victory and the lives saved. Nearby, Chief Silas looked up, his battered and bruised face covered in sweat and dirt, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound relief that their fortress walls had held. Barrett let out a triumphant, thunderous roar, raising his fists in victory as Lyra, Silas, and the other weary warriors stood on the wall, their faces softening with the realization of their survival. The courtyard of the fort erupted into wild celebration as a crowd of horn-eared warriors raised their spears and axes in the air, cheering and chanting the name of the celestial seer. Ethan stood atop a stone battlement, leaning against a large stone block and looking out over the landscape as the giant red moon slowly set on the horizon, bringing an end to the longest night of their lives. Inside a dimly lit cavern, the Crimson-Hoof chief sat quietly on a stone ledge. His muscular body was covered in scars and blood, and his face looked exhausted, but deeply grateful under the cool blue lighting of the cave. He remained seated in the quiet cave, reflecting on the realization that strength was not the only rule of the wilderness, the blue light illuminating his rugged features as he prepared to make his final choice. Outside, as families and children gathered, Ethan gently held a small child in his arms, his face soft and compassionate while a crowd of refugees and warriors looked on. Chief Silas stood proudly in front of the colossal, dead-armored beast, which still had the glowing blue runic spear deeply embedded in its shoulder beneath the glowing red sunset sky. The Crimson-Hoof chief walked slowly through the ruined city gates, surrounded by his warriors and other horned defenders, his posture solemn and deeply respectful. Approaching the center of the courtyard, the chief dropped to one knee on the paved stone ground, placing both hands on the stones as a formal sign of his absolute submission and loyalty to the city. He bowed his head completely to the ground in a deep kowtow, pledging that the Red Claws would serve as the first guarding tribe under the gates of the divine city, even unto 10,000 deaths. The massive stone city gates were opened wide, allowing groups of villagers and refugees to walk freely through the entrance, symbolizing the successful unification of the two clans. From inside the gates, the Crimson-Hoof chief remained kneeling in submission in the foreground, while Chief Silas and other defenders watched from a respectful distance. The kneeling chief maintained his solemn expression as refugees carrying young children and supplies walked past him, entering their new, secure sanctuary. A line of red-horned Crimson-Hoof warriors stood with their hands tied behind their backs, accepting their integration and capture into the new city's labor force as atonement. A crowd of kneeling refugees, including women, children, and the elderly, looked down with expressions of relief and weariness as they were systematically processed and welcomed into the city. Several high-ranking tribal elders and generals, including a stern-looking warrior with curved ram horns, stood on the wall with their arms crossed, watching the newcomers enter. Ethan stood on a wooden platform, looking down with a serious and focused expression as he held onto a wooden post, overseeing the massive integration of their new citizens. Lyra stood nearby, her bright blue antlers framing her face, which was flushed, pink with deep hope and admiration for the peace Ethan had built. Chief Silas stood proudly in front of his warriors, holding his long spear, his chest bared and covered in dirt and scars, embodying the military strength of the coalition. Ethan and Lyra stood together in front of a new black flag, showing a golden stag emblem, symbolizing the official birth of their unified territory. Ethan reached down to pick up a curved animal bone knife from the dry earth, representing the collection and redistribution of tools and weapons for their grand construction projects. Holding the bone knife, Ethan looked thoughtful and resolved, while Sienna watched him intently from the background, ready to assist her master. A vast host of refugees and warriors marched along a dusty mountain path toward the newly secured fortress city under a cloudy gray sky, ready to begin a new life. Ethan gripped the curved bone knife tightly, his strong hand emphasizing the rugged texture of the tool and his unyielding grip on their future. He used the sharp bone knife to carve characters into a thick wooden beam, beginning with the character representing the sacred deer. The city's leaders and key figures stood together on a high platform, looking out at the vast territory during a breathtaking sunset as the bright sun rays shone through the watchtowers. Ethan finished carving the characters for Stagscry into the thick wooden plaque, officially naming the newly unified stronghold Stagscry City. Ethan stood proudly in front of the finished plaque, looking forward with confidence as the golden sun set behind him, marking the birth of a new era. Lyra, Barrett, Silas, the Crimson-Hoof chief, and their warriors stood together in solidarity, representing the unbreakable union of their respective clans. Ethan stood on the battlements, extending his hand outward in a welcoming gesture to the vast crowd gathered below under the brilliant, golden sunset. An extreme close-up of Lyra's face showed her eyes shining brightly as a single tear of joy and relief rolled down her flushed cheek, overwhelmed by the peaceful resolution of their struggle. The main leadership group stood together before the grand rebuilt stone gates of Stagscry City, looking forward with pride as the morning sun rose over the mountains. Safe inside the cave shelter, the Crimson-Hoof chief looked out cautiously from the entrance alongside other red-horned members of his tribe, checking the battlements. Inside the cave shelter, the Crimson-Hoof chief and his warriors watched the distant defenses with intense focus, their faces lit by the warm glow of torches. Inside the rocky cavern, Ethan stood triumphantly amidst the bright, roaring flames against the dark, red-tinged sky, capitalizing on his engineering and fire to hold off the monstrous tide. A close-up of a warrior's powerful, muscular legs clad in fur-lined wraps showed them standing firmly on the stone floor,